This is one of what is typically two beginner seminars that I try to run every year. One in January for all those people that are new to the hobby, have seen displays over the Christmas season and seen them and said, I could do that, or I'd love to do that. And somehow or another they found their way to xLights and they're keen to try to use xLights to create their displays. Or we also get a fair number of people that come across from other sequences and would like to understand what all the fuss is about, and whether this is suitable for them. And it's a great opportunity to see what's involved in getting a show set up and potentially help get you through those first couple of weeks of setup and configuration. I do run another one typically around about the September timeframe for the people that have decided that they want to get everything going for that Christmas, or those people that just feel like they need a refresher and a reminder before they get going with earnest in setting stuff up. And I also typically run something on X schedule around about that early October timeframe, when people are finally realizing that they need to actually set up a schedule. And for those that have chosen to go and use their PC to run their show, it makes sense to run an X schedule session then. So anyway, this is the January one. So being it's a new one, and being that this gets posted on YouTube and the person watching it may never have even downloaded xLights, I'm going to start a little bit earlier than I normally do. Normally I assume you've got it installed and you've at least been playing with it, but I'm going to assume that you haven't. xlights.org is the project's homepage. There's a couple of things here that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is the Zoom meeting. The Zoom meeting is where this particular training is being held. It's open 24/7. Basically a virtual meeting room provided by company zoom.us. It's a computer video conference. You can also dial in using a telephone. You can also access it using a smartphone application. Through the year, these seminars are held in this meeting room. There's also in the US a Wednesday night meeting that's held from about 7 p.m. New York time. And every Wednesday night it runs until very late. If you don't get in there till 11 p.m, there will still be people in there. And there's some formal presentations. The X Essentials series is run inside that meeting room. But there's also a lot of people talking about Christmas lighting and other non-related topics. You should always feel free to jump into that meeting. Ask your questions. There's lots of people in there willing to help. They can set up breakout rooms if your question's really detailed and it needs a lot of assistance. For those in Australia, the Australians commonly gather in the Zoom meeting room, this same Zoom meeting room, from about 7 p.m-ish on a Friday night, again until late. During the busy season, the room's pretty much, well, the room's open 24/7, but during the busy season, which is from sort of mid-October onwards, there's pretty much people in here 24/7. And if you're having issues with setup or challenges like that, you should feel free to drop in at any time. Last year, hundreds of people were helped get their shows up and running, help them with configuration issues in xLights, in the Falcon Pi player, or in their controllers. So it's a great resource for the community, and we encourage you to use it. For the rest of the year, to be honest, it's there's commonly people in there most evenings, not every evening. Pop into the room if there's someone there, have a chat. If not, move on. The download page is, of course, where you gain access to the xLight software. The xLight software runs on Windows, OS X, and also on Linux. You can directly download it here for Windows. There's a 64-bit version. There is also a 32-bit version for those people running it on older hardware, but you'll need to come down here to the detailed list to gain access to it. The OS X version, Dan Culp provides that, and there's a link here to his distribution. And then the Linux version is maintained by Chris Debenham. Again, a link to his site if you want to use that version. Also up here are a number of other things. The forum is the Nutcracker forum. This is probably, well, this is a support forum. It's nowhere near as popular as it used to be, although questions are still asked and answered in here. You kind of pretty much, if you ask a question here, it's probably only one of the developers and a handful of others that are likely to answer you. The official xLights Facebook group is probably where the bulk of users hang out, and it's a very busy place with lots and lots of posts. So both are available. The other thing I'd highlight here is the videos page, videos.xlights.org. This video will be located here, as are many, many others. Some of these are provided by the project. Some of these videos are other people's videos. Anyone can suggest a video that they think is useful to the community. There's a bunch of these ones are generally my ones where I've gone through and done release notes or talked about a particular feature. Can a Spade of Christmas is also here, as are several others. Good idea to look in the popular videos. The popular videos are typically a sign of the sorts of things that that are relevant, and so things like how to sequence AC lights and importing a sequence and configuring controllers, etc., are always popular, and videos that you probably should watch. Some of the videos are a little bit dated. To be honest, xLights moves along pretty quickly. A release comes out on average once a week. And so you will always encounter, as you go into the older videos, things that are slightly different now. The only way to really follow it and stay up to date is to watch all of the release videos, etc. The reality is that's why we do these things every 6 months, is because it allows us to update our beginner seminar with the latest and greatest of everything that's going on. So those resources are key. If you're in the group of people that are brand new, never done anything before, I cannot recommend enough this particular manual. This is the ozchristmaslighting.com 101 manual. You access it by going to the Oz Christmas Lighting forum. You need to sign up. And once you signed up, you can download this forum. This is a guide. It's not biased to any particular hardware or software, but it goes through and explains everything electrical, everything about controllers, configuration. It talks about what those strange IP ratings mean that you get on your pixels. It's a forum. It's based here in Australia, run by a couple of guys down here that invest heavily in the community, and there's some great resources on here. There's also probably the last active chat room on this site where you can go and text chat with people in real time about Christmas lighting and the like. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about actually xLights, which is probably why you're actually here. So when you fire up xLights for the very first time, you're going to be asked to select a show directory. A show directory is basically the folder in which xLights is going to want to store everything about your show. You need to create a folder. You would typically put it somewhere in your documents folder. Some people like to use something like a Dropbox or put it onto a separate drive. You want to be backing this thing up. This is going to be where you're going to invest all of your time and effort, and sequencing a Christmas light show is a non-trivial activity. You are definitely not going to want to lose everything. So whatever you do, wherever you happen to put this, please make sure you back it up, and you back it up regularly. The show folder itself, you can have more than one of them. Most people would just have the one, but you can have as many show folders as you like, and every show folder is like a fresh install of xLights, with the exception that the options carry forward from each, and we'll talk about that in a second. When it comes to show foldering names, give your show folder a name that does not include the date. Do not call this show 2019. Because the following year, the show folder is going to change and it will cause you issues. I cannot emphasize this enough. people do this all the time. If you really want to put a date, put it in the folder underneath the show folder. So here I've got the January 2019 seminar. That's when it is right now. But I'm calling my show folder show, or Christmas, or Halloween, or whatever you want to call it. Just don't put the date in here. I cannot emphasize this enough. This will make your life so much easier over time. You won't notice in the first year, and you'll be another one of those people that says, oh, it works for me, I don't have a problem with it. But you will have a problem with it eventually. So keep it simple. Just no dates in this final folder. Doesn't matter what you have here. Okay, and the reason this matters is because when you move your show folder to another computer, as long as this name remains the same, it doesn't matter what this is. It doesn't matter whether this is a path on an OS X machine instead of a Windows machine. It doesn't matter if this is under a different user. It doesn't matter what this stuff is. As long as this folder name doesn't ever change, xLights is smart enough to find everything inside the show folder and keep everything working okay. So make sure you do that. And that gets us into xLights itself. So xLights itself, obviously it's all about sequencing your lights, and there's really three things that you need to worry about if you're going to set up a show in xLights. The first tab is the setup tab, and the setup tab is where you define how to talk to your controllers. So if you don't have any controllers yet, if you don't know what your controllers are going to be configured or what they're going to look like, if you just don't even want to work with your controllers yet, you just want to play with your layout and maybe start to create some sequences and see what it looks like, you do not have to put a single thing onto this screen. You can entirely ignore it and just move on to your layout. Now your layout here is where you set all of your props up. It's like a preview of your show on the screen. This is where you will put your trees and your stars and your outlines on your house and everything else on this screen. This is the place that you're going to want to start. This is the first thing that you're going to want to start to do. Again, you can't really do anything wrong here. If you put the wrong prop, if you set it up slightly correctly, you can always come back and change it. And because of the way xLights works in the vast majority of situations, if you set up a tree that's 50 high and 24 strands, and then when it comes time to build it in July, you suddenly realize that, hey, I've got some extra pixels and I want to make it 32 strands and 100 high, that's okay. You might need to tweak a few effects, but at the end of the day, xLights just knows that there's a tree, and the sequence or the sequencing just is on that tree, and you can change the configuration of the tree here. And then finally, there's the sequencer tab, and this is where you're actually going to create a sequence for a particular song or a particular animation for a show, something that you're going to play in your show. So the three key tabs are here in the body of the sequencer. At the top here, you have a couple of toolbars. You can drag and drop these. If you don't like them there, you can drag them over here. You can make them float. You can bring them over to the side, and if you place them in the right place, they'll dock. Probably for some reason that's not working particularly well, but if I grab one of the longer ones, generally speaking, these will dock into the side screen. So you can put them down the bottom, you can put them over to the side, etc. That's all fine. And obviously there's a bunch of menus up the top here. As this is a fresh install of xLights, I've wiped all of my settings. Everything is in its default configuration. Before you get too busy into doing anything, I would definitely come up here and review some of these settings, and there's a few things that I would change. I'm not a big fan of render on save. It just slows everything down, so I'd definitely get rid of that. Never turn this off. I don't generally back up and save, but you absolutely should back up on launch. That sort of guarantees that at any point in time, every time you run xLights, you always know that everything's been backed up and that you can always go back to your original state. I don't generally turn on purging backups. The only disadvantage of this is that xLights does back a whole bunch of stuff up, and you do end up with a lot of backups. So if you leave it on never, you'll probably want to manually go and clean that up. Although these days, most people have machines with fairly large hard disks, and this is not a problem, but it's up to you. Backup subfolders, I would definitely turn on. If you don't turn this on and you store your sequences in a subfolder underneath your show folder, xLights doesn't back them up, so definitely turn this on. Most of the rest doesn't matter. I'm going to turn on small waveform because I'm on a laptop and it gives me a little bit more screen real estate. You can also, what else is it? The render cache, if you're working on a big show, I would almost certainly enable this. If you're using video, you definitely want to consider enabling this, or at least manually locking all of your effects. Otherwise, the performance can be pretty poor. Anything else here that's important? Autosave by default is set on 3 minutes. The only time I would change that is if you're bringing in some large LOR sequences and you're not bringing them in as a data layer. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but you're bringing them in as effects. You can end up with some really large sequences. And what will happen is every time the autosave kicks in, xLights will actually pause while it saves it. Generally speaking, you don't notice it. xLights will generally save your sequence in less than 1/10 of a second or so, and you don't even notice when autosave is on. But if you've got a really big sequence, it can become quite noticeable and annoying, and you may want to spread out the autosave. The autosave is useful because if something goes wrong and xLights crashes, autosave gives you a way to get back to that particular. And beyond that, I think that's about it. I think I would leave it pretty much as is. All right, so that's your settings. There are a couple other settings in the view menu that you might want to consider. If you've got a bunch of AC lights and you're coming from LOR, you may want to turn on the AC toolbar, which is this toolbar here. That toolbar will let you sequence xLights when you're doing your AC lights in a way that is much more similar to how you may be used to in LOR, and you may want to display that toolbar. And I think that's about it in terms of options. So let's move on to our layout and let's start to think about it. Now, new this year is the concept of a 3D layout versus this, which is the default, which is a 2D layout. And there's a lot of chatter about, well, should I use 3D? Should I use 2D, etc. And to be honest, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Both will work. My view is that, look, 3D looks very cool, and there are definitely some new ways to sequence using different cameras which allow you to set up effects that sort of are rendered from a slightly different perspective. But beyond that, to be honest, 3D, other than the visualization, etc., is not going to give you a great deal of difference. If your show is largely viewed from one place, then to be honest, 2D is probably easier and good enough for you. If you've got a show with a great deal of depth and you want to take advantage of that depth and you want the effects to recognize that there's a lot of depth there, or if you've got a property which has potentially multiple sides to it, or if you're doing a show which, you know, is a walkthrough display, etc., and people are going to see things from different perspectives at different times, there are some significant advantages to 3D if you're sequencing those sort of shows. But you know, the cost of 3D is it's fiddly to set up, and we'll go through and we'll do a little bit of 3D here. And so there's a lot of sort of, movement that you need to do. If you've ever, used MS Paint or something to just paint, it's quite straightforward to use. And then you've moved to something like a Blender or a SketchUp or something, and you do 3D. It's a lot more involved. It's a lot more time consuming. And at the end of the day, from your lights perspective, you largely end up with the same result. So it's up to you. It's definitely worth having a play with, and if you create a new show folder and go in there and play with it, you're not going to affect your main show. So it's definitely worth having a play with, but don't necessarily assume that you have to use 3D or you should use 3D. Now, I have issued warnings in the past about when you move into one of the 2019.1 plus versions, everything is inherently 3D, and that's true. So if you were to take this show folder and open it with an older version of xLights, the older versions obviously don't know anything about 3D, and so your mileage may vary in terms of how well that file actually loads up correctly. If you use the 3D, it definitely won't load up very well. If you use the 2D, it may still look okay. I'm not sure, and we wouldn't guarantee everything. I think what happens is all your models move down to the bottom left-hand corner, which is not particularly helpful. So really, once you're in 2019, it's more of a fix it forward. We need to move forward. Now, this here is your house area. The green box represents the default area. You can change the size of the green box by changing the width and the height down here. If you were using 2D, and I would expect the vast majority of people would, the first thing you're going to want to do is set a background image. And I suggest that you grab a photo of your house, ideally with your Christmas lights on it. This is my place a long time ago. But the beauty of having your lights on it is that when it comes time to lay your props out, you know exactly where they actually go. Whereas if you take a plain copy of your house, that's not so true. So this is my house. You would typically turn the brightness down here, so you can set it to 30% so that it's not as bright. I would definitely use a photo in the dusk rather than during the day. It becomes harder to see where everything is if you use a photo that's fundamentally pretty bright. So I would definitely do that. Now you'll notice if you zoom in and out, and that's simply done using the mouse wheel. The green box basically is a box around the image of your house. And it gives you that sort of recognition of that, well, that's where everything is. Now, adding props in 2D mode is really as simple as coming up to all of your models up here and choosing the model that best represents whatever it is that you're wanting to put in place. So here, for instance, I have a smallish pixel tree, and so I would come up here to the tree, and if you click on it once, and you come down here and click and drag down to the right. Now, it used to be it didn't matter which way you dragged. So I used to drag up and to the left when I was drawing things, but now in 2019, you do need to drag it down to the right. You make it approximately the right size, and you can drag and place it into place. Now, each model then has a set of properties associated which describe exactly how that tree is configured. Now, if you haven't built anything yet, then I strongly suggest you get in and model it up in xLights first, because inherent in pretty much all of the models is some assumptions or some settings which support the way in which the tree is configured. And if you then go and build your prop differently than one of the ways in which xLights allows you to configure the prop, then you're going to have difficulty when it comes time to sequence it, etc. And you're probably going to have to replace the prop with a custom model or something. For example, here's a 360 tree, and xLights really only allows you to start the wiring in one of 4 places. Well, and technically it's actually 2, right? So it's either the middle at the back at the bottom or the middle at the back at the top. You can then choose to go clockwise or anti-clockwise around the tree, but you must start in the middle at the back. So if you start your wiring over here on the left, there is no way to configure this tree model to recognize that your beginning point is over here on the left. And when it comes time to sequence it, etc., yeah, it's going to be fine when you're putting up standard patterns like, a bars effect going up, you're never going to notice. But as soon as you go to put an image or something onto the tree, the image is going to be rotated by 90 degrees and it's going to look really strange and you're going to get frustrated and you're going to have to go and build a custom model. So yeah, pay attention, draw the model out in xLights first, understand where xLights assumes that the start channels are or the start points are, and wire your tree accordingly. Now I'll come back and go through some of these settings in a minute, but let's go and put a few more things on here and recognize the sorts of things that we can put here. So here's a star and a star again, simple as clicking and dragging it out. Very, very easy to put in place. Now, if I want to here draw a couple of trees here, you can actually click twice on the tree up here and you'll see it goes a slightly grayer gray. And now you can come down to the trees and you can just quickly draw multiple trees. Okay, you don't have to keep going up, and then you click it a third time to take it back out of the drawing mode so that the next time you go down here, it doesn't draw yet another tree. If you want to align those trees, you can drag around, select them, right click on them, and you can align them. So you can align them at the bottom so they're perfectly aligned if that's what you want to do. Once you've got them in a position that you like, I suggest that you right click and you lock the tree in place. The beauty of that is that you can't accidentally now drag and move the tree around or rotate the tree accidentally. In most shows that are of any size, you're going to have a bunch of models. Those models are often going to overlap with each other, and it can actually get a bit painful at times to select something because you kind of have to click multiple times as it goes through the Z order and tries to select the right model. And if you accidentally click and move it slightly, all of a sudden things are moving around. And so by locking them in place, it stops you accidentally moving your props and mucking your display up. It doesn't stop you from changing all of these other settings. It just stops you from accidentally using the mouse to move things around. All right, there's a number of props up here, so let me quickly run through them. So arches are for drawing these arches down here. When it's perfectly horizontal, you'll see there's a red line at the bottom of the arch. Once you get it out of alignment, the red line goes away. It's a little fiddly to get it there, but once it's there, it's fine. You can actually also use one arch to represent multiple arches if they're chained together. And there's some settings over there that we'll go through. Candy canes are useful for drawing candy canes. Again, by default, it gives you 3, but you can change the number of candy canes, or you can just drop multiple and make each one an individual candy cane. This is great for a single line of pixels in a candy cane. It's not great for, say 3 lines of pixels in a candy cane. This is also usable if you've got just vertical sticks of pixels, which some people like to put along their paths and the like, so that model can be used as well. The channel block model is not commonly used, but if you're coming from a law world or maybe a Vixen 2 world and you're used to just sequencing at the channel level, the channel block model can be a useful way of just saying, you know what, I just need 16 channels and I just want to sequence the channels. I don't want to do all of this stuff down here. It's just easier for me to create a bunch of channels and sequence it. And so the channel block model, just put them up here, or we'll talk about putting them on another preview. Create yourself a block of channels and you can just sequence it just like you would your old AC lights. And that's why the channel block model was introduced. The vast majority of people don't use this. The circles model basically draws a circle. Now it can actually draw a circle with multiple layers, and we'll come back to that. This is the new cube model. Doesn't really make sense in 2D. It's really a 3D model, and so we'll come back to that when we get to 3D. The custom model is the catch-all. right? So if you've gone and wired this tree in a way in which we don't support and you still need to get it into xLights, the custom model is where you're going to be going. If you're doing a wireframe or a coro prop where the pixels are punched through the coro in strange patterns, etc., the custom model is where you're going to be going. It's going to let you lay that stuff out, and we'll come back to that as well. The DMX prop, this is used primarily for things like moving headlights, you know, those spotlights where you can control the pan and the like, and move the head around. It's also usable for floodlights. There's a couple of ways to do floodlights, but one of the options is to use the DMX model. And it also is useful for servo controlled elements or other DMX props like smoke machines and bubble machines and things like that. You would typically use the DMX prop to model those channels. The image model, the best use for the image model for me is if you've got, so I've got, for instance, a blow up Santa Claus, and it has a string of AC lights running up the middle of it that lights him up. So I model my blow up Santa Claus using the image model. It basically allows you to associate an image with this particular model. So I'd come in here. I think I have a Santa Claus in here somewhere. Right, there's a Santa Claus. And he will change in the how bright he is according to how much I turn the lights on. So it's a great way to visualize blow-ups. You can also use it for, you know, maybe you've got an AC wireframe that you turn on and off, and the image model can be a great way to just say, hey, I've got a reindeer or something. So that's what the image model's all about. Icicles are there for, you know, where you've put icicles along your roof line. Your icicles model will let you do that. The single line is great if you're just drawing a single line of pixels somewhere. So if I just want to draw a single line across here. But to go with that, there is also the polyline. So if you've got a situation like my fence here, and I've got a line that needs to continue like so, the polyline is really useful. About every 2 weeks, someone asks a question, how do I stop drawing a polyline? And it's simple as pressing the escape key gets you out of draw mode. And so polylines are a great way to draw a complicated line. It's also useful for roof lines and the like. When you're drawing something like a polyline, I would generally draw it starting from where the data starts. So in this case, I've drawn it backwards because the data actually starts back here at the house. So you would typically start it here and draw it forward rather than drawing it in reverse. A spinner model is great when you've got spinners or even half spinners, etc. And there's a bunch of settings down here that you can use for that. The window frames is great for you know, drawing around your garage doors or your front door, etc. And we'll come back and we'll configure that. We'll get rid of this line of pixels at the bottom, which aren't actually there. And then finally here you've got the wreath model. And the wreath model looks exactly like the circle model, but as you'll see in a minute, it has a slightly different wiring pattern when we start to add multiple layers, and we'll walk through that. Then there is this download, and the download basically gives you access to a repository of downloadable models. So you can come over here. It's actually drawing a custom model here. And what it will do is it goes and accesses the website. So you'll need to be online to use this. And so it's busy downloading. Hopefully there it is. And so here there's two libraries, the Boyskoyo Studio library who are included, and then there's a DMX fixture library which contains a whole bunch of smoke machines and moving headlights, etc. And configurations. And here you can come in here and you can find a particular model. So come down to a particular prop. You choose the one that's actually the one that you're using, and you can click on Insert Model here, and it will download and insert that model into your display. And so this is actually just a custom model, so I don't have to go and draw one. You can import these, as many of these as you want, download as much as you want. You know, try them out. And if you like them, I guess you can go and purchase them or go and build them yourself, either way. The OBJ stuff is, again, only useful in 3D, and we'll jump into 3D in a minute. So let's talk about some of the configuration properties on these models, because you actually need to go in and say, well, how is each of these models set up? So let's start back with our trees here, and the tree model will actually support several different types of models. By default, it's drawn here as a 360 tree, but your tree may not be 360s. It might be flat, it might be a spiral, etc. And in order to get xLights to draw your tree, or the right sort of tree, you need to come over here and start playing with the properties. Now, there is a video that I've made that talks specifically about how to configure trees, and it talks through all the different options and why you would do certain things. So I'm not going to go through it in excruciating detail here. This is a bit of a beginner seminar, but I would definitely refer you to that video and suggest that you watch it. The first thing you need to do is work out what sort of tree you're drawing. And there's three types. So there's a round tree, which is any sort of tree where it's not flat against the wall. So if this was a 180 tree or a 270, you would choose the round option. If it was a spiral tree, you would also choose the round option. A flat tree is useful if you're building a ribbon tree. So, you know, if you're doing either flat strips or flat nodes, etc., and it's hard up against a flat surface. In fact, I have one of those now right underneath this star. That's the way you would go. And then there's a ribbon tree, which is slightly different. The only thing that's slightly different about it is the top looks slightly different. So there's a few different styles of trees. But this particular tree here is actually a 270-degree tree. For two reasons. One, I use the pixel strips, the nodes punched into the strips, and consequently you can't actually see the LEDs at the back. Combined with the fact that no one walks around the back of my tree, it's kind of pointless actually putting pixels there. So there's actually a gap here at the back of the tree where there are no pixels, and that lets me get a little bit more density with fewer pixels. The only other settings here that really matter, I mean, you can change with the bottom and top ratio and everything, and that'll change slightly how it looks. So for instance, you know, if this was a column that I was wrapping the trees around, you could do a column like this. You just change the top to bottom ratio to be 1, and now it's like I've wrapped a mesh around a column. So yeah, there's a bunch of options here that you can use. The real things that matter are the strings, the nodes per string, and the strands per string, because this is telling xLights about exactly how you've used or how you've wired this up. And so the first thing you need to think about is the number of physical light connections I have back to my controller. Now, xLights is always going to assume that if you have more than one string, that those strings are always the same length. So you might have, you know, 3 strings of 300 pixels, and xLights, this model will support that perfectly. What it won't support perfectly is if you've got 2 strings of 300 lights and one of 200 lights, the tree model is never going to be able to properly represent that, and you end up in a world where you either choose to configure the tree in xLights to have more channels than it really does, and then not worry about whatever appears on those extra strands of the tree, or you're going to have to go and build a custom model for it. So again, this is one of these situations where, you know, if you're building a pixel tree, you're about to pixel tree, plan to have every string of lights the same length, because that's how the model assumes that it's going to be. It's not that you can't do it the other way, it's just going to be easier. So let's say that I do, and I think this one is a 3 string tree. So this is the number of physical connections that I have back to my controller. Now, I'm going to skip over nodes per string. Let's go to strands per string. So the strands per string, as you can see, I've changed this to 3, and now I just have 3 strings of lights. And that's because I've said here that there's only 1 strand per string. If I fold these lights over at the top and I bring them back down once, that's 2 strands on each string. So if I change that to 2, I now end up with effectively 6 strings of lights. Okay, 3 strings up and down. Okay, if I wanted to have, and this is actually an 18 strand tree, so there's 18 lines of lights that go up and down, and so I actually need to make this 6. Sorry, keeps jumping. Because there's actually 6 sets of lights going up and down. Now, I actually have 6 sets of lights going up and down, but there's actually 19 pixels. So how long is my string? Well, oops, didn't do that. Oh, it's 19 pixels by 6. So 19 times 6 gives me 114 pixels per string. So if I make this 114, I end up with a tree that has the right number of pixels on it. So it's 3 strings, 3 connections to my controller. Each connection has 114 pixels on it, and each 114 pixels is basically representing 6 lines on the tree. So it zigzags up and down 6 times. All right. Now, by getting these properties right, will mean when it comes time to do things like uploading to controller and the like, it will use this number of 3 to recognize that, hey, this has actually got 3 connections to the controller, so it's using up 3 ports on the controller, and that's why it matters. Now, if you don't know, then it really doesn't matter. So if, for instance, I don't know how many connections, I haven't built the thing yet, and so I'm just trying to play with xLights and get it working, it doesn't really matter. So, sorry. Again, so if it's just 18 strings by 19 pixels, that's 342 pixels. So I could also equally set this up as 1, 342, and 18, and it's going to look exactly the same on the screen. If I was to upload it to the controller, it would now just use the 1 port, but it doesn't really matter. It will not affect your sequencing in any way. This is just telling xLights how the tree's actually wired up, and the only thing it impacts is if you go and upload to the controller. If you never upload to the controller, then you don't really need to match it. But you do need to make sure that the node layout is correct in terms of it goes up and down. And the way you can see that is you right click on the model and look at the node layout. And the node layout tells me that node 1 is down here. The pixels go all the way up to 19, and then 20 is next to it, and it comes back down again. If that's how your tree is wired in reality, then as long as that node layout looks correct, it doesn't matter whether there's 6 strings or 1 string or 27 strings. It really doesn't matter. It just matters that the nodes are laid out correctly. And then when xLights does its bit, it's all going to look okay. If that's not how your node layout was, is if instead you'd wired it so that each string of the tree was its own connection and the lights just ran up to the top and then the next one came down, then you'd just come down to here and you'd say, you would say, well, that's 18 strings and 1 strand per string and 19 long. And now when you look at the node layout, right, node 1 of every string is at the bottom of the tree, and the nodes go up to the top. And when you get to the top, it comes back down to the bottom, and the next one's like that. And so if that's how you've wired your tree, that's how you want your node layout to look, because when you sequence in xLights and you get your data and you go to push it into your controller, that's how it needs to be set up. But you can change this at any time. I could have gone and sequenced the whole tree, spent months creating sequences, getting everything looking okay. I come back to my tree, I start to build it, and I realize, oh, damn, it's different. That's okay. You just come in here, change the settings, get it all okay, go back to your sequence, you just re-render it, you don't have to change anything, and it will just adapt automatically to the layout of the nodes. So they're quite separate. The only thing that can get a little bit funky is if you suddenly make this tree twice as high or twice as many strands, etc., sometimes you'll need to fine tune some of the effect settings because they can be sensitive to how wide the tree is or how high the tree is in terms of number of pixels. But just changing the node layout here is not a reason to have to go and throw all your sequencing away and redo it. It's one of the beauties of the way in which xLights works. And it's one of the reasons why you can bring in some sequencing from someone else who's got a tree, but it's an entirely different size, and you can still take their effects and put them onto your tree and have it look good. All right, let's move on because I feel like I've belabored the point. Let's quickly do this as a slightly different tree. Let's imagine that this is a spiral tree. So again, I would leave it as a round tree. But I would start to play with this spiral wraps, and maybe the lights are wrapped around, I don't know, 3 or maybe it's 5 times. Here you'd want the number of strings typically to be 1 or maybe it's 2. And you can see that it now turns it into a spiral tree. You might have 100 pixels on this instead of 50. But it's basically the same, and maybe you've got 2 strings, in which case it's 2 strings, 2 separate strings to control, but that's how you would create a spiral tree. Okay, let's touch quickly. Candy canes, you can change the number of canes here, you can change the number of nodes per cane, you can say it's actually a stick and it's not a a candy cane, but it's actually a stick of lights, etc. The arches, you can change the number of pixels per arch. If these are AC arches, it's really just a matter here in nodes per arch, you'd say the number of segments. Let's say you've got 8 segments. Because they're AC, you might choose to say, well, I want to show 10 lights in each segment. So although that's only 8 segments, it's actually going to show 80 points of light, so it looks like an arch properly. And then you're going to want to come down to the string properties. By default, all props are assumed to be RGB. Most xLights users are building pixel shows, but if you're building AC or you've got AC elements, you'll need to come in and say, well, actually, no, that's a single color node. In this case, it's red, but you could change that to be white. And you'll notice up here that it starts on channel 6577 and goes to 6584, which is 8 channels. Okay, so it's just an AC arch where each channel controls an 1/8 of the arch. And so that's how you would build an AC arch in xLights. Now, if it was a pixel arch, of course, by default, this is a 50 node pixel arch, right? So it's one arch, it's got 50 nodes. And if you come down and look at the string type, it's RGB nodes. So you might have put a strip of 50 pixels or 50 nodes inside a PEX tube or something. And that's how you'd model that particular type of arch. These string type properties, which enable you to sort of say what type of lights are connected to your model, all the model types largely support different ones of these, and you just need to choose the right sort. By default, it assumes they're RGB nodes. They may be in a slightly different color order. You can change that. You can also come, let's say, to this single strand here and say, actually, no, that's a dumb RGB. And if it's dumb RGB, you choose this 3-channel RGB. And the model up here is now using just the 3 channels to control that entire string of lights. So, you can turn it to red, green, or blue, and or any combination thereof. But when you do it, every light on that particular string of lights changes to that particular color. So yeah. All right, let's move on. And I'm trying not to go too deeply. There are videos out there that go more deeply into all the settings on all of the models. Probably there's a series from back in 2016 where most of these models are covered in detail in the ACL videos. let's go to the polyline. The polyline's extremely powerful. You know, it lets you move them around once you've drawn them. You can also choose a segment, and if you right click on it, you can add a point, which will add a point in the middle, and so it lets you split the polyline. You can also select a segment and define a curve, and that will give you these reds, and you basically can create a Bezier curve. So when I do my arched windows or these lights that go around the arch here, you can use the polyline to actually draw the pixels in an arch. So you don't just have to approximate with straight lines, you can actually do the arch. You can also come into the segments here, and if you click on the individual segments, you can expand it out, and you can come in here and you can actually say how many pixels appear in each segment. So if this was 30 pixels in this segment, or the first segment, I can define it there. If this, which is, so this is segment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I've got more pixels in my arch here, I can come here and say that's 40 pixels. And it will add 40 pixels into that particular segment of my polyline. So you have a lot of control over what goes into each place. It's really quite a powerful way to do things. Now, if these things are not actually wired together, then I would generally not build them as a polyline. I would separate them into either multiple polylines or multiple single lines. A polyline makes most sense when all of the pixels are connected together. Let's go and do our window model here. Our window frame model is assuming that you know, you've drawn it around a door or a window. You do get to say there are no pixels at the bottom. So if this is a doorway, as it is, you can get rid of all the pixels at the bottom. Most of these things have starting locations, so you can get to decide whereabouts the lights actually start. Again, strongly recommend you take a look at the node layout, because the node layout is going to let you more easily visualize where things are. So in this particular case, where's node 1? Well, node 1's down here in the bottom left, so it's going up the left and around and down to the right. If I wanted to change that to bottom right, I can do so. And now if I look at my node layout, everything's all good. Node 1's down here, but node 2's over here. It's kind of, what the hell? Well, it did start there, but it went over to here instead of going up this way. So there's another setting here that you need to change, which is, to use the American term, counterclockwise. You'll need to go this way. And so now if we look at our node layout, node 1 starts down here and it goes this way, which is exactly what we wanted. So happy with that. So always check the node layout and make sure it's doing what you expect it to do. You know, same back with our tree here, right? My starting location is bottom left. Well, what does bottom left mean? Well, bottom left means that it starts back here, right? At the back of the tree on the left-hand side here, and then it will go up and down the tree and it will come around to the back, and it'll end over here. If I'm starting at the bottom over here and I'm coming this way, then I'm going to want to make that bottom right. And that's going to make the bottom pixel over here. How do I know that? Well, if I come in again and I look at my node layout, where's node 1? It's down here on the right, bottom right. And the pixels, well, in this case, they're just going up because of the settings that we have on the model. So pay attention to the starting location. It matters. Again, if you get it wrong and you sequenced everything, come into the layout, fix the node start channel position, re-render, and you'll be fine. You don't need to go back and resequence it all. xLights is just using that to map your effects to the actual channels that it's going to output later on. The spinner model, you have properties like, the number of arms that you've got on your spinner, the number of strings of lights that you've used to wire it. In this case, it's assuming that everything's connected together. But if you've used 2 strings of lights, you'd put 2 in here. And you'd obviously reduce the number of arms per string to 4 because you doubled the number of strings. You can decide how many lights are on each arm. You also get to decide how big the arc is. So if yours is not a full spinner, but it's a half spinner, you can make it a half spinner like that. Of course, if it's not actually orientated that way, you can play with the orientation up here, but understand that when it comes time to sequence the buffer, and the buffers don't always look like the models physically do on the screen, but this is the buffer that's going to be created, right? So it's going to still be a matrix, because at the end of the day, xLights always renders on a matrix, no matter what it looks like. So our spiral tree down here, when you look at the node layout, it doesn't look like a spiral. It looks like a matrix, very tall matrix with not very many rows, sorry, not very many columns, but it's still a matrix. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can change that as well. Things like the circles model, etc. Actually, well, let's do it with the star model because it's even better here. If you've got a star, but you've got multiple layers, you can come in here and define the layer sizes. So let's say that this is actually a 40 pixels on the outside, then a 30, and then a 20. If you put those numbers in here with a comma separation, it will actually create, and I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it, it's actually created a multi-layer star based on those. Now you'll notice that it hasn't really done the right number of pixels, and the reason is because this adds up to 90 pixels, but I only gave it 50 nodes. So I need to make that 90 as well. And now you end up with a star that truly is three layers of 40, 30, and 20. Again, pay very, very strong attention to the starting location. The star doesn't let you start anywhere. It's quite specific. There's only two places that the star model assumes that you're going to start wiring. One is in the crotch of the star just here, and one is at the very peak at the top of the star. So if you're starting the star wiring over here, that ain't going to work. So pay close attention to the particular layout here. Again, the node layout and the star's default node layout is actually a sparse grid. You can see that node 1 in this circumstance is here in the crotch of the star. So pay attention to that and take advantage of your node layers. It's one of the reasons why when you people buy the stars, where the Coro stars, where you punch pixels and they look for a model for it. Generally speaking, you don't need a model for it as long as you've got the star model and you set the layers up correctly. Although I do believe that you can download this star model for them as well. You can do similar things with the circles and the wreath. You can say it's actually two circles of 20 and 30. In this case, 20 on the outside, 30 on the inside. The difference between the circles model and the wreath model is the wreath model doesn't let you define those different layer sizes. I don't think. Yeah, a wreath is just a circle of lights. All right. And then you get your custom model. Now, a custom model is quite interesting because you have this model data here, and this is where you actually can come in and you can start to change the model. So if you need to move a pixel around or you want to create something new, you edit in here and you use these numbers to indicate things. So let's create a simple custom model. So this creates a blank custom model with nothing in it. And I can come into the model data here, and you can pretty much draw anything you want. You can come over here and say the size of the custom model. It doesn't have to be square. In this case, I'll make it square though. And you can come in and you can just put numbers anywhere. There is an auto numbering thing down here where you can click active and auto increment, and everywhere I click, I'll get a number, and that will become my custom model. That's kind of nice. If you're building a, if you're not building a pixel custom prop, but you're building a maybe an AC custom prop or something like that, you can also do so. Again, I'll make the grid a little bit bigger. And this time what you want to do is, let's say that this is a 3-string custom prop, and I want to show the LEDs. what you can do is you can set the auto numbering up here, set this stuff active, which means I can click, but instead of putting a different number in every place, it'll put the same number. And so all of the ones are going to be lit up at once when I light up the first channel on this model. And then I can increment it to the 2s, and I can come over and click the 2s, right? And then I can click the 3s, and there's my third string. Okay, and so this is how you would typically set up. Maybe you've got, maybe using mini lights, and you've got a singing face, which is a dumb singing face where, you know, one channel controls each of the mouth positions and one channel controls the outline of the singing face. This is how you generally wire or set up a custom model for those sorts of props. But if you're building a singing face using nodes, then clearly you would want to, let's just quickly download one. I say that quickly, but so you could come down into singing elements here, and I could choose a bulb. Yeah, it looks good. Right, so here's my singing bulb, and if I come in to look at it, make it a little bit smaller so you can actually see him. Right, so here he's used individual numbers for each one of these, but I could equally say I'm going to convert this into dumb lights just by going and over typing each of the numbers, and with a, you know, the same number or the same 8 numbers for an 8-channel type singing face. Yes, it's tedious to do, but it's very doable. So that's how you do it. Not every prop, but most props, you can right click here and choose a wiring view. The wiring view is really cool because it shows you how the prop is wired together. By default, notice it is the reverse view. This makes a lot of sense if you're pushing pixels through the back of a piece of Coro. You invariably are doing that from the back, and so having the reverse view means that I'm pushing pixels the way it looks here. If you're not pushing them through the backs, you want to see the front view, you can choose to see the front view. Obviously now the pixels go down this way, so it makes it easy. And you can print this out. You can set it to black on a white background so it prints easily, and select print here. For a model with lots and lots and lots of nodes, you might want to make the font a bit smaller, reduce the size of the numbers so that they're not as cluttered. You can also export it. So there's export and export large, and that will save this as an image file, and then you can print the image out using your photo printing software, image printing software, etc. If you find that the way in which xLights prints it is not to your liking, knock yourself out, or you can annotate it or do whatever you want to do with it. This is kind of cool. You know, if you're giving the kids the snowflake to punch the pixels into and they need some instructions, print the instructions out, give them to them, and set them off. Obviously, the bigger props, okay, I'll select the right model. The bigger props get a lot busier. You can see things are all over the place. This is really useful. Okay, what else have we not touched on? So let's throw a matrix in, because for some reason we didn't throw a matrix in.
Keith,
yeah.
just to clarify, when you're drawing a model, you start at the top left and go bottom right, but when you're using the multi-polygon, you start where the connection is.
Yeah, so when you're drawing any line element, so same is true of your icicles, etc., I would always draw them. So if my icicles are on this side, but they're connected up onto my balcony here, which is where all my controllers are, right, I would generally draw them out this way. If I'm drawing a single line, and you know, this single line across my garage starts here, I would draw it this way. The drag out thing is it's just how the drawing works. If you can drag it to the top and right, but you can see it doesn't go anywhere, you need to drag it down to the right in order for it to draw properly, because this is the point that anchors, and then you move it around. But the thing is with these props is the start position has nothing to do with how you draw it. Whereas with the line props, like the snowflakes, sorry, the icicles and the straight lines, etc., where you start from is by default the starting position. You can change it. You know, if you've drawn this wrong here, you can come in here and say that it actually starts at the blue square end. But I would generally draw them the way in which they've been drawn. You can do the same thing here. You can say that this actually starts at the blue square end. In that case, the data is going to be assumed to come in here. But again, my preference is generally to draw them the direction that they're properly going rather than playing around with starting locations. All right. What else we got? There's a very strange set of models. It's going to be fun to sequence. All right. Before I move off layout, so there are a bunch of other things. So let's quickly rattle through these. So all the properties up the top here are all these settings around exactly what the prop looks like. Once you get down below the previews, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about previews, but basically what xLights allows you to do is actually have multiple separate previews which allow you to set your models up slightly differently. There are some significant implications with using this, and I would generally encourage people to think really hard before they go that way. But basically, I can create a separate preview. I can create as many of these as I want, but you know, for instance, if I had this channel model because I wanted a sequence on it, but I don't really want it cluttering up my display, I can come down to the preview and I can say, can you put that on the unassigned preview? And now it's disappeared. You can't see it here, but if you were to go to the unassigned preview, it's over here now. And so you can separate your props out. Generally speaking though, if it's visible and I want to be able to see it in my show, I put it onto the default preview because life's easier that way. And I would encourage people to think really hard before they go down that avenue. Some of the other things that are down here, strand and node names. Look, generally speaking, you wouldn't set this. There are some circumstances where it's kind of useful, particularly if you're doing moving heads, for instance. So if you've got a moving heads, and let's put it in 3D so it looks like a moving head. You know, if you've got a channel in there that is the pan channel or something, I would come in here and name my node. So I'd say, hey, that's the pan channel, that's the red channel, that's the gobo channel, or so on. That can be useful later on when you get into sequencing and you want to know what that channel does. It gives you a way to document them, but otherwise I wouldn't generally name my strands. Most props also enable you to define faces. Generally speaking, you would only do this for something like a singing face like this, or potentially a matrix or a tree where you want to display an image on it that sings. And the way you would do that is you come down to this faces element here. By default, it displays junk. And what you do is you'd add a face. Let's say, you know, I want to add a snowman on here. It's a matrix, so I'm going to want a matrix. A matrix lets me display images on the faces here. And so you can come in here, and if you double click on here, you can go and choose an image for each one of these mouth locations, and the images over here give you an idea of the sort of mouth shape that you should be using. There's also a download images thing here, and if you click this button, it goes to, again, the xLights site, and you can come and choose the sorts of things that you want. So I wanted a snowman. Let's have a look. Do I want Olaf? Probably not. Yeah, probably not. You do need to consider the density of your matrix. A lot of these images are really quite large, and you don't necessarily want a really high resolution. It's taking its time. Taking its time. All right, well, we downloaded that one. Okay, and so what it's done is it's downloaded all of those images and it's put them into a location here. Double click on it, you can see it's brought down all the different mouth shapes. You'll notice each image has got a slightly different mouth shape. And so xLights has already automatically downloaded them, connected them up to the right mouth element. And so if I'm going to do a singing face later on, that image will be displayed on my matrix if that's what I choose to do. And you can define as many faces as you like. You don't have to have just one. I could have a snowman and I don't know, a Dracula or whatever else I want to put on there and define them all. And then in different songs, I just choose a different face that I want to display on my matrix. It's the power of using matrices for faces. If you've got something like this bulb here, you'll also need to describe the faces, but you need to describe it slightly differently. Unfortunately, in this particular circumstance, the face hasn't come down with a face definition loaded. It'd be kind of nice if it had. But again, I can come in here and use node ranges because it's a pixel face, and I would have to come in here and say, well, what pixels do I want associated with what? So for instance, take the face outline. Well, the face outline, I need to choose which pixels are associated with it. Now, if you do put your mouse over the top of each pixel, it will actually show you what number pixel it is. I'm going to guess that it's 1 to 64. It does nicely light them up for you so you can see which ones are which. So this actually ended at 69, so I can come in here and say, actually that's 69, there's my outline, which is pretty easy to do. My eyes open, I'd probably want to do the outline of my lights here. This is time consuming to say the least. It seems to start at 155 and go to 167. So we'll go 155 to 167. That was pretty easy, but I've got to do the other eye as well. So it seems to start at 146, no, 142. 142. Well, so this one's it's a bit all over the place, isn't it? 139 it seems to start at. So you can have separate ranges. So let's do 139 to 143. No, see, I don't want 143. I want to make that 142. And then 3, 4, 5, so it's probably going to be 146 to 154. Okay. So that node range there represents eyes open, and you would have to go and do that for each one of these, put in the range of pixels that are necessary. Now, generally speaking, you can find someone who's previously done that for you, but remember, they have to have wired it the way you've wired it. So this is why it becomes really important exactly how it's been wired. Having this printed out would obviously make that process a lot easier because I could just look on here and decide which pixels I wanted to include in each of those faces. So setting up faces is, it's not hard to do. You do it once, you do it here, and once it's done, every time you choose to use those faces in your songs, you don't have to go back and redefine it. That prop now knows how to sing, and hopefully, in this case, Boscoyo will update this singing face model to include the face definition, and then as long as you follow his wiring, you won't have to do it at all. I won't touch on dimming curves. Dimming curves are used to change the way in which the lights are output. You can do global dimming on the model, and you can do some color adjustment and the like in there. I'm not going to go through states. There's videos that talk about states. Submodels I will touch on briefly. Submodels are a very powerful way to take a model such as, let's take this bulb. Let's say I wanted to sequence the screw part of the bulb separate from the body of the bulb, because maybe I want to make this a sort of brassy color, but then I want to change the outline of the bulb. And I don't want to be sequencing the whole thing. I don't want the whole thing to turn red, because let's face it, I've never seen a light bulb where the screw lights up red. And so what you might want to do is submodel the bulb down into those smaller subsets of pixels. And you do that by clicking on the submodel dialog. And it's very similar to the faces. Although in this case, it has been submodeled. Someone's already done it for us. So someone's already gone and said, what's the base? And it's described all the pixels, and you can see that the right pixels are highlighted, and it's done exactly the same way as the face was done, right? Pixels 1 to 22 and 28 to 32. So obviously he's not wanted to include the bottom of the bulb itself in the base, which is kind of cool. Maybe not how I would have done it by default, but there's no problem with that. And then the body of the bulb itself, then he's managed to make that a full circle, which is kind of nice. And interestingly, in here, he's actually gone and put the mouth shapes in. That's kind of interesting, because that would imply that you're going to manually sequence it. The only place where actually that might be useful is if you were importing maybe some channel data from LOR. Let's say you'd done some old AC faces, and now you'd gone and upgraded yourself to a node, a singing face, and you wanted to bring that old AC data across from LOR to make this singing face, use the old AC data. This could be kind of useful to do that. And then obviously he's got some eye control here going on, and you definitely may want to control the eyes separately for various reasons. So there's some kind of cool submodels in there. But you can submodel anything. You can submodel this matrix. We can come down here to submodels. And maybe you want to get a little bit lazy about it. Maybe we just want to generate. Maybe we want to generate, I don't know, 10 vertical slices. Okay, so there's 10 vertical slices. Right, now the power of submodeling is each one of these submodels will be something that you can sequence. So you'll be able to put an effect on just those pixels without creating it as a separate model, which is really, really powerful. Of course, so let's submodel this tree. So the other thing you can do with submodeling is we can add a submodel, we'll leave its default name, and you can actually draw the model. So it brings up a representation of the underlying buffer of the tree, and you can say, I'm going to freehand draw, right? I'm going to freehand draw something. Looks good. And so what it's done is it's created a submodel that contains the pixels that I just selected by drawing on my tree. And I'll be able to sequence just those pixels. So, any model can basically be submodeled, with maybe the exception of the DMX model, which doesn't make a great deal of sense. So a very, very powerful concept, and created a great deal of flexibility. It enabled me to get rid of a whole bunch of models that I'd created where I deliberately mapped the same channels so that I could render things slightly differently. Submodels, extremely powerful. We talked about string type. Appearance, size, location. Generally speaking, I wouldn't play with these a great deal. The only time I would is some people like to draw floodlights using the single line model. And the way you would do that, in fact, I do 8 of mine like this, is I've got, let's call this floodlights. Imagine I've got a line of floodlights. I've got 8 of them. There's 1 light per node, which is fine, but they don't really look like floodlights. And so if you come down to appearance, you can actually increase the size of each pixel substantially. And you can even come in here and make it a blended circle. And so I can get something that looks a little bit more like a floodlight. And I actually have a set of these that run down my fence here. Like so. And that's how I model my floodlights, which is kind of cool. Now let's imagine they were RGBW floodlights. That's cool. We just come down here and say they're RGBW nodes. Where's RGBW? There we go. And now they're 4-channel floods down the side of my fence there. So I think that's it. So the only other thing is this controller connection. And controller connection is entirely optional, and you don't need to worry about it until you're at a point where you're thinking about configuring your controllers. Now, I haven't set up any controllers or anything here. You notice I've just been drawing props all over my house. So you don't need to worry about this at this point in time. You can come back to this later. The other thing you'll notice is I haven't really been, saying exactly how each prop's connected together or channels or anything else. What xLights has been doing is it's just been making sure, if I sort these by start channel order, it's just been allocating channels and just daisy chaining them onto each other, guaranteeing that there's no overlapping channels. And that's kind of nice, right? This is what makes it possible for you to just get into xLights and start drawing props. And I could go and create a sequence now and start sequencing these props, and you don't have to worry about anything. But once you get time to start setting up controllers, and maybe you've got your controller there and you want to start using it, etc., that's when it starts mattering, and you need to start thinking about, well, exactly what start channel, how am I going to get the data from xLights to the controller and things like that. And that's when you need to jump back to your setup tab. So if your controller is not going to arrive to July, you don't need to be worrying about the setup tab until July. But if I've got that string, if let's say I've got this string of pixels here right now sitting on the floor beside me, and I've got a controller and I want to start pushing data out to the controller, then you're going to have to go back to the setup tab and you're going to need to start describing, well, how am I getting the data to the controller? So let's quickly touch on that. And if you don't have your controller yet, you can skip this part of the video and jump to the sequencing. Now, the way the data gets to the controller depends on what sort of controller you're running. If you're running a Renard, which is a serial controller, you would typically get to it via a dongle on your computer, then you're going to want this add USB setting, because that's how you would set up a dongle that is directly attached to your computer. If your Renard is actually attached to a pixel controller and you get to the pixel controller by sending E131 data, then you're going to want to add an E131 universe, because that's how you're going to get the data to the controller, which is then going to send the data onto the Renard. If you're using most of the pixel controllers, you're going to want to generally add E131. In some circumstances, you may want to use ArtNet, but the vast majority of people generally use E131. If you're using a FPP controller, you may choose to use DDP, and there's a good write-up that Dan did about DDP on the Falcon Christmas website. It's just a little bit more efficient. Well, it's a lot bit more efficient for sending pixel data out, but the FPP is the only thing that's really good at using it. So you'd only go there. If you're using law controllers, you have two options. If you've got a small number of law controllers, like 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5, 16 channel controllers, you can do that using a USB. But you also have this law option down here, which gives you a little bit more configuration control around the controller. If you're using any of the law network, i.e. serial device type pixel controllers, you're going to have to use the add law, because the USB one will not talk to them. So if you've got a Pixie 8, you're probably going to want to be using the add law. I will caution you that the law, this one here, is much more efficient than the one up here. But even this one maxes out before the law one would typically max out. So if you're successfully running a Pixie 16 on your law network, and you've got lots and lots of pixels attached to it, you are going to find that we're going to lag once you get beyond it. I don't know what the actual point of lag is, but generally speaking, I'd avoid the Pixie controllers as much as possible. To me, it's not a great design. Law has better options if you like Law hardware with their Pixicon range. E131 controllers are just so much more flexible than the serially attached controllers. It works fine, like I say, for smaller controllers. But once you get into pixels, I would generally recommend you go with something like an E131 controller. The null range, which is the only one I haven't talked about here, this can be kind of useful for something like if you're going to run a P10 panel and you're going to run it on a Falcon Pi player, and you're not going to be sending the data to it, you're just going to be playing the data directly off the controller. That's where you would generally use the nulls. If you're a newbie though, I'd stay away from this, generally using E131 unless you're using a really, really big pixel P10 or P5 matrix, in which case you might need to consider other options. To do these things, you just click on the add button and you need to configure them. In case of E131, you can do multicast or unicast. In the vast majority of situations, I'd use unicast. The only place I'd use multicast is if you're running a bunch of Wi-Fi pixel sticks. You might use multicast because there are some circumstances where multicast is advantageous with Wi-Fi. But if you're using a wired controller, I would always use unicast. There is absolutely no reason for using multicast. Multicast is less efficient. Controllers handle it less efficiently. So I would always use this. So you'll need to type in the address of your controller. Now let me check which controller this is. Oh, I really don't want to do that one. Let's do 73. So you put the IP address of your controller in. You then need to define universes. Now, universes are just groups of channels. It's just a way in which the data is organized. As long as those universes are generally unique, they're going to be sent to this particular controller. It really doesn't matter what number you use. You can use any number between 1 and 64,000. There's a whole stack of universes. I kind of like to start my universes at a nice round number on my controllers. So, you know, this might be my first controller, so I'm going to start at universe 100. In terms of the number of universes, if your controller supports 96 universes, do not put 96 here, right? The reality is I've never seen someone need 96 universes to drive their controller. There is invariably unbalanced configuration of your controller. You don't put a full set of pixels on every single output, and so you're not going to need the full 96 universes. I would typically allocate a number of universes that I think I'm going to need, and I can always come back and make it bigger later. I'd also strongly suggest you use this one output checkbox. The last channel, 510, 512, it depends on the controllers. Some controllers care, and hence we default to 510. But in this case, this is a Falcon controller, and I can just as easily make this 512. The Falcon controller won't care, and it's good practice. It's good practice to put in a description of your controller here so you know what it is, but make it something that's distinguished, right? This might be my inside F16 V3. Don't make the descriptions all the same. It doesn't really help. Click OK. And you can see what it's done is it said, well, I'm going to send universes 100 to 119. Each one will contain 512 channels. And if you multiply 20 by 512, you end up with 10,240. So this is the number of channels that are going to be sent to that controller. And it's as simple as that. If I've got another controller, which I do, 192.168.0. Let's send it to a V4. Which is 75. Again, okay, new controller. Let's create a new universe range. This is only a V4. I don't know. Send 8 universes there. Again, it really doesn't matter that I've set that to 510. As long as I do it consistently. Oh, I forgot to set a description. This might be my test controller. Okay, and click Save Setup here, and that saves this away. All right, and that's how it is. It's simple as that to set up controllers. If you want to add your USB controllers, you would come in here, you choose your protocol. If it's a Renard, you'd say it's a Renard. The ID number is not mandatory. You can leave it as 1, but it's kind of nice if you make it a unique number that doesn't overlap with your universe numbers, because there's some ways that you can use this in addressing. And so I might decide to make that 10. You'll need to choose a COM port that your Renard is connected to, and you'll need to choose a speed. And the last channel here, you're going to want to specify the number of channels that are on that controller. I don't know, maybe it's 64. All right, and this is my Renard. Okay, it's as simple as that. Now, if you want to move these around, it doesn't matter that they're out of order here. There are different controllers, but if you want to, you can drag and drop this up and reorder them, or you can use the arrows over here to reorder them. It's fine. Now, because this controller actually don't have a Renard, I don't have any serial controllers. So if I was to turn on output to lights up here, I would get an error. And so if you've got a controller that you are going to be using in your show and you want to sequence it, but when you run test mode, it's not actually there, you may want to right click on it and come in and deactivate the controller. And that will stop xLights trying to connect to the controller when it's not there. You can also deactivate these things, which will stop xLights from sending data to those particular controllers as well. So, you know, if you want to limit the amount of traffic on your network when you're testing, you may want to do that as well. That's the bulk of it. If there are other ways to define your channels here. A lot of people sort of, instead of having one row representing 20 universes, they'd actually lay out 20 rows. That's fine, it will work. The only downside of it is obviously you've now got 20 rows to maintain instead of 1. But there are some bulk edit. Oops, didn't mean to do that. There are some bulk edit things that let you select multiple rows here and change things like descriptions and IP addresses and number of channels and all of that sort of stuff. You can also, you know, a great way to get to the controller is you can just go open controller here and it will fire your browser up, and assuming this controller is turned on, which I think it is, it will go and log on to that controller and bring its web page up. There you go. You can also ping the controller. It says it was successful, which means it's obviously available. All right, so that's how you do setup. It's as simple as that. You just describe how the data gets. Now, the next thing you need to do is you need to tell which props are on which controller. So, and that's done by setting start channels. So let's go back to our layout and because we were going to test this string of lights here, and let's imagine I've put this onto my Falcon 4v3. So remember, my Falcon 4v3 is on universes 200 to 207. And by far the easiest way to do that is I would come into this start channel, right? And what I would do is I'm going to say it's on a universe number. I can leave this as any. I don't have to choose the controller in this circumstance because the universe number is unique. So I'm just going to say any, and I'm going to put it onto universe 200. Okay, and it's going to be the first start channel on that universe. There's nothing else on the controller. I may as well start at channel 1, and I'll click OK. And you can see that it's now set up to go to universe 200 start channel 1. And if you expand this out a little bit, we can see that it's going to finish on universe 200 start channel 3. Now, why is it only using 3 channels? Well, remember, we set this thing up as a dumb string of lights. We set the string properties here to 3-channel RGB. So let's change it back to RGB nodes. And so now you can see it's using 150 channels, which is what you would expect 50 pixels to be using. And it's simple as that. Now notice that all of these other props here are now also on that F4 controller. And the reason for that is because these things are all chained to the end of this thing. Let's imagine that's not true. You know, let's imagine I didn't really want that. I actually want to chain those things onto the end of image 1. And so I can do that here as well. I come down to here and I can say, well, no, it's not actually at the end of single line. It's at the end of image. Okay. Actually, was it image? I think I broke that. Press Control Z, undo it. Oh, it's on the end of icicles, that's why. You gotta look at the right column. Icicles, 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 first icicles, right? That's better. Okay, so there it is. So these things are all back there, and here's my single line. Now, because we've just been mucking around, there's actually a lot of channel overlap that's going on here. You can see that this matrix goes from 9,188 through to 11,587, and my single line here starts on 200. And that's just because you know, I haven't been very careful with all of these other channels. And there's a great tool here called check sequence, which will go and scan everything in your setup, and it will come up and it will start to give me errors around my configuration. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of errors. And one of the errors that it's flagged is that, hey, my matrix and my single line seem to have overlapping channels. And that's probably something that I don't want to do. So for the sake of simplicity, let's prevent any overlapping channels by getting rid of everything and just ending up with our single line on 200. Now, the other thing that I may now want to do, now that I've put this onto a particular controller, is I may want to come down here and set the controller connection. And the controller connection basically lets me say, how is this string of lights connected to my controller? And let's say I've decided to plug it into port 3. So I can say, hey, it's now connected to port 3. I can choose the pixel protocol. Most of your lights are going to be 2811s. And then there's a couple of other controller type settings that I might choose to override here. But by default, generally, most people wouldn't do it, but you can. So, I could come in here and I could say, actually, I want the controller to set these things to 30% brightness because it's indoors and I'm testing. I don't need them at full power. And I can set that configuration up that way. Now, at this point in time, I'm testing. Maybe what I want to do is I want to configure that controller. So at the moment, this controller, is this the right controller? No, this is the V3. It's 75, wasn't it? No, it's not 75. 192.168.0.75. Yeah, F4v3, that's it. So at the moment, this is actually set up to listen to universes 1 to 20. So that's not right. And obviously my string ports are not going to be right because I haven't actually configured anything. So these things are set up for something else. I don't even know what this thing is. In fact, let's go and very quickly zero this out. Yeah, sorry. Clone. Let's clone it 11 times. All right. So we've zeroed our controller out with zero configuration in it. So we need to configure this controller so it's ready to receive the data. And the way you would do that, because we've set up the controller connections and everything else, is you would come down here to the particular controller in question, you'd right click, you go to this upload to controller. And we need to do two things. We need to upload the input definition, which you should always do first, and that tells the Falcon which universes to listen to. It only takes a second. Down here it says its uploads complete. And if we go back to the controller and we look at what universes it's now listening to, you'll see that it's now listening to, well, okay. Why is it listening to universe 10? That's interesting. I don't know why it's listening to universe 10. Clearly shouldn't be listening to universe 10. That may be a bug. That's very strange. Oh, let's delete it. I'll back to that later. All right, we'll do that quickly again. And we'll go back to the controller. And there we are, 200 through to 207, which is our 8 universes that we said we wanted the controller to listen to. And now we need to upload the output definition, which basically is going to configure the string ports. Again, it only takes a second to do. This was the default configuration. It's all in red because it's pointing to universe 1 and the controller is now listening to universe 200, so that doesn't exist. But if we refresh this now, we'll see that output 3, which is the one we configured, has got our single line. It starts at universe 200, start channel 1, and it's 50 pixels, which is exactly what we set up in xLights. Now, there's much more detailed videos on configuring and setting up and uploading to controllers, and there'll be more this year because there's been a few recent changes, so we will update those videos as well. But that's how you configure your controllers, and at this point I can now start to sequence an output to lights, or I can go up here to the tools menu, and there's a test mode here. And so I can go down and choose those particular universes and start to send data, or I can go to that particular model and I can start to send data out to that particular model. And so that is currently sending data to the controller. And if I go back to the controller, go to its status page, you will see that the pixel count, the packet count data here is slowly going up because it's now receiving test data, of which the only thing that's kind of useful is the stuff on 200, because that's the only output that we've properly configured. So that's how to set your lights up. It's how to define your setup and send data out to your controllers. But as I said, you don't need to spend a great deal of time doing that, because until you've got a controller to set it up to, you don't need to worry about it. So layout and controllers. Let's move on a little, because I'm conscious that it's, what's it been, 40 minutes. It's not too bad. Let's move on and talk a little bit about sequencing, and then we'll loop back around and maybe clean a few things up towards the back end of the video. So I'm going to get lazy again. Go delete the model. Let's throw a few things down here. I always go up and right. Drives me nuts. Oh, let's talk about 3D, because I haven't talked about 3D yet. So let's throw some models down. Really not that important. Let's put a polyline in. A curve. Looks good. Let's put some arches in. All right, it's looking good. So let's go into 3D. Now to access 3D, it's really as simple as just clicking on this checkbox here. Now when you click on the checkbox, here we are in 3D. You can see our house image has gone away. That's deliberate. You can bring it back if you want to. You can add it back in here, but by default it isn't. You'll also notice that everything is skewed off to the right. And the reason everything is skewed off to right is because the 0 position here is in the middle. But in 2D mode, the 0 position is down here in the bottom left-hand corner. So consequently, everything is off to the right. You'll also notice that nothing's on the ground, and the reason nothing is on the ground is because the ground is technically down here and the props are all well above that. So the ground plane is quite different. This has implications, because if you come into 3D here and let's align some of these props with the ground, at least let's align the trees at least with the ground. And let's go back to 2D mode, you'll notice that it's put the trees down here at the bottom of the screen. And this is one of the disadvantages with jumping backwards and forwards between 2D and 3D mode is, this photo is taken with me standing in the middle of the street looking at my house, and the props at the front of my property tend to be quite low on the picture. And as I move back, and this is quite a distance, right? This is almost 30 meters from the road back to my house. So as you look back, the props get higher and higher up the image, and then my house is finally here. But when you're in 3D mode, the ground is the ground. So you're effectively, it's almost like you've taken the photo by laying your face or your camera down on the street and taking a photo, so that the ground is at the bottom of the frame, and the house appears like it's also right on the ground. And so that slightly different perspective makes it really hard to jump backwards and forwards between 3D mode and 2D mode and necessarily get what you expect. And this is why it generally ends up being a choice about, am I going to be a 2D sequencer or am I going to be a 3D sequencer? Technically, you can see I can check and uncheck it, and I can move stuff around, and I can say, oh, actually, I want to move that arch down to there and come back to 3D, and the arch is now a lot closer to the ground, etc. I can come in here and move this arch. It's actually easier to move props. Now, zoom it a bit. I can move this arch over to the left, etc. But when I go back to 2D, my arch is now gone, and the reason it's gone is because it's all the way out here. Okay, so that's the disadvantage with jumping backwards and forwards. You kind of want to choose which way you want to go, and generally speaking, you want to stick with it. In terms of navigation, to swizzle it around, it's just a click and drag. If you want to pan it, you need a mouse with a middle wheel, and if you hold the middle wheel down, you can drag it left and right, up and down, and so forth. The up and down didn't previously work, but the later releases, Gills added the ability to move it up and down, which is kind of nice. You can zoom in and out using the wheel. And then there's also a bunch of control and shift keys and all that sort of stuff, but I'm not going to go through all of those things in detail. When it comes time to move the models, first of all, you need to select the models. Sometimes you'll have to double click and the like in order to do so. So, get used to double clicking a bit. You can zoom in and zoom out, but basically by default, the first time you click on a model, it's in this move mode. The move mode has got these 3 arrows, and if you want to move the prop in that direction, you have to put the mouse over the arrow until it turns yellow, and then you can start to move the prop in that axis. So if I want to bring it towards me, I need to click on that one. Move right, I need to click on that one. If I click on the orange box again, I move into sizing mode, and so each one of these things is now a sizing bar. If I hold the control key down, it does all the dimensions at once. If I don't hold the control key down, it just does one dimension at a time. Okay, and sizes it in that dimension. And then finally, if you click one more time, you get the spin. And so again, I get to spin things around the axis. All right. Now, understand that you go back to 3D, you're not going to see the same thing, right? It's distorted and everything else, but the Z-axis rotation is not going to be visible back in 2D. It's just not how it works. We'll rotate it in the XY plane. The way it works is this has always been X, this has always been Y, and so consequently Z has have to become the backward dimension, and that has to happen because otherwise everything would need to change, and that's just not practical given that so many people have got a huge investment already in their sequences. So yeah, so that's how you simply move and resize. Now, it's interesting because it's actually quite hard. 2D representation of 3D is not that easy, and so consequently, when you get to things like, let's say I'm drawing a star here, and I want to put the star on top of the tree, it can be a little fiddly to get it exactly right. Let's move it across. It looks right. I think I need to go a bit higher, go a bit back. Oh, I'm off to the right. So let's move it back to the right. Okay, looks perfect, right? So let's go over here. Oh my God, right? So you've got to look at it from a few different angles to make sure. Oh, actually, I haven't still got that right yet. Let's line that up. Ah, that's right. And that's just because at the end of the day, you're always seeing a 2D projection of what's actually going on, and so having the right orientation when you're doing the moving is really, really important. And so now we've got a star that's actually on top of the tree. And so what you'll find is laying out a 3D display is enormously time consuming. You'll spend a huge amount of time just getting everything in the right place. And that's before you end up with something like a polyline, right? Because a polyline, you know, by default, it draws in the 2 dimensions, right? But now when you click on an individual dot, each individual dot is movable in 3 dimensions. Now I can bring it forward, right? And so now you've got to go and manipulate every single position in 3 dimensions. It's enormously time consuming. You can still do the same things with curves and the like, but now the actual Bezier is in 3 dimensions, I think. Yeah. So yeah, a very, very time consuming process, and those people that go 3D will invest a significant amount of time just in getting their layout right. Now, on top of the typical objects that you've been putting into your display here, there are also a number of other things that you can add, which are called 3D objects, and you access those over here using this add OBJ. So you can add images, grid lines, and meshes. Let's start with images. So one of the most useful images that you can add is an image from Google. So here's an image from Google, which is my house. I'm going to want to come down and rotate it. In this case, I'll need to rotate it around the x-axis by 90 degrees, which will lay my image flat, which is exactly where you would expect a satellite image or an aircraft taken image of my house, or maybe it's a drone image of your house taken. You may want to play with the scaling again. All right, you can come down here, click on this, hold the control key down and drag it out, right? Or you can come over here to the properties and you can say, oh, I'm going to scale it manually, and you can just set the scale. Okay, and so now when I go to lay out my props, I can go and put my props in all the right places. Now, the thing you'll notice about this image is actually skewed such that the street's over here, whereas in 2D, the street is here at the front. And so one of the things you're probably going to want to do is rotate it around the y-axis. Sorry, not the y-axis. It must be the z-axis. Right, a little bit more. Still a little bit more. 140. Oh, getting close. 145. Maybe that's about right. And so now it's basically facing the same way as my street, and then maybe I want to move it. Oops, I'm still in sizing mode. We'll move. Oops, chose the wrong one. And maybe I want to move it over here and line it up with where the 2D was, so I can see the ground. Now, if I want to bring my original house image back in, again, I could do the same thing with adding an image, and I could add my house image in here and line it up as well. You can also add additional sets of grid lines. You can rotate them around, delete them. You can also hide them. So you can have that there, but you can click the active button and hide it so that it's not visible. So it's still there. You can always bring it back at any time, but it's hidden. The other thing that, of course, you can do is bring in a mesh. And a mesh is basically a 3D representation of your house. What you'll need to do is you'll need to find an appropriate piece of 3D software, build your house in it. It needs to be software that exports to the OBJ format. And if I go, Go to my show folder here. Here I have the export of my house. It's a pretty simple one. This is the OBJ file that was exported. This one happens to have come from SketchUp. There's a couple other files here. There'll be one or more of these JPEGs if you've added textures to your model, so that, you know, in this case, I've just got the roof and the brickwork. I haven't bothered with everything else. And there's this MTL file. Now, these all have to be in the same folder. The MTL file basically tells the OBJ file what JPEGs to use to display. So if you don't have these files here, if you just have the OBJ file, you're going to get a very basic rendering of your house. It's not necessarily going to look like your house. So to do this, again, I come up and I have to select the OBJ file. So I go into my folder, I select my OBJ file, and there is my representation of my house. Again, I'm going to, you can see that it's come in at a very, very different scale, and so I'm probably going to want to scale it up. Again, I find it's generally easier to come into here and just manually set the settings. Moving it around can be a little bit difficult. Sometimes it's helpful, to make it mesh only. That way you can actually see the handles here. Currently in sizing mode, which doesn't help. Come on, let me grab it. Oops. Okay, now we're upside down. It's not helpful. Okay, so we're in rotate mode. Now we're in sizing mode. And so I can drag it over, put it in the right place. You can see that it's clearly rotated incorrectly. I would need to rotate it again. Probably around, no, this time the Z's, it's not the Z. This time it will be the Y. Yeah, that was not right. We want to go, oh no, let's do 150. We're getting closer. Make it even 200. No, maybe it's minus 150. Okay, we're getting there. All right. Rotate it back around. And what I want to do is I want to line it up with my satellite image, which is about there. We'll zoom in. We'll move it back. And now it's roughly on top of my house. And so now I can go in and start to move my models around and place them appropriately. Now, notice, depending on which tab is active up here, depends on which objects this thing's going to want you to select. Because I'm currently in the 3D objects, it wants to select 3D objects. If you want to select models, you have to go back to the model tab. And now, of course, it's biased to wanting to select models. And so now I can start to move my trees around. I can realize that, hey, my tree's the wrong scale. Help if I grab it first, hold the control key down, and I can bring my tree down to a much more sensible scale. Make sure it's on the ground. Okay, and now you can see it's slightly out. I think my tree is actually help us. And I can bring my tree out and put it where it is. And you can see that having the image there makes it so much easier to put things in the right places when you're in 3D mode. So you'll spend hours in this, laying everything out, getting it exactly right in the right place, lining things up with the face of your house and so forth. You know, a polyline, you know, although you can select the polyline and move it in its entirety, you may need to resize it slightly. All right, again, I find it easier if you line yourself up with a particular axis, get it right on that axis, then move around to the next axis and say, you know, I'm going to bring it down. and bring it in. And move it aside. Okay, and you'll spend hours doing that, getting it all right. Okay, so that's kind of 3D, how to set it up, how to bring in the various elements, how to hide them, how to show them. And of course, when you go back to 2D, all of that stuff disappeared and everything's back where it was. And that tree that we just moved very, very carefully into place is in entirely the wrong place for my 2D, which is why you need to choose which way you're going, whether you're going 2D or 3D, because you can never get it both right. You're either one or the other in terms of model positioning. Okay, let me just quickly check my notes here. Is there anything else that I wanted to do? We did background images, we did 3D. There is one more thing. In 3D, it's also possible to save certain camera positions. So, like I said, this down here is kind of the default, but it's not really how we do things. So in this case, the perfect place to watch my show is probably here. You can right click and you can save the current viewpoint. Right, and so, I can call this the sweet spot. Right, this is where my audience is going to see it from. Right, but I can also decide to say, actually, you know what, I want to have a bird's eye view. Right, and say that there, and so I can save the current viewpoint. Oops. Oh, sorry, I overwrote that. So I can come here and say, look, this is the overhead view. Right. And so forth. So I can set up all of those, and then I can load a viewpoint. Oh, I deleted it. That's why. I wasn't paying attention. All right, let's go back to our sweet spot. All right, save, current viewpoint. There's our sweet spot. All right, and so now I can load a viewpoint, I can go to my overhead view and it will jump there. I can load a view and go to my sweet spot and it will jump there. And so, yeah, you can save those camera positions. You can save as many of those as you want. You'll also be able to use those camera positions when it comes time to render certain effects. So, if you're on a corner block and people are seeing your house from this direction as well, you may want to save a camera view from each of the main places that people watch your show so that you can start thinking about rendering effects from that perspective to deliver that that experience. Okay, what else have we done? We've done all the key model types. We've done that. Yeah, we've done all of that. All right, so let's go and play with creating a sequence. To create a sequence, you do not need to go to the sequencer tab before you create a sequence or open a sequence. You can do it from here. The number of people I see do the unnecessary click always amuses me. To create a sequence, you click on the new sequence button. You get to choose whether it's an animation or a musical sequence. If you just click done now, it's going to create a 30-second animation. Most people will be creating musical sequences. Simply a matter of clicking on that, and then you need to choose an audio file. Now you'll notice that my show folder here, I've put all my audio stuff into a folder under my show folder. It is by far best practice to keep all of the things that you use in your show folder or in a folder underneath your show folder. Don't go loading the audio from another directory on another drive, etc. It'll work on that computer, but it won't work when you move to another computer because that path won't exist. Whereas if it's under your show folder, xLights is smart enough to be able to say, oh yes, that's right, it's in the audio folder inside the show folder, and it will still find it even if the directory names underneath are quite different. You can choose an audio file. By default, it sets the filter to the audio files that are used by FPP2, or you can choose FPP1 depending on which show player that you're using. If you use the xLights one, you'll find that there's a broader range of audio files that it will support, but obviously you run the risk that if you actually end up deciding to play it on FPP, it may not be able to play that audio file format. So if you know you're going to use Xschedule, you can quite safely use the xLights audio files. But if you think you're going to use FPP, I'd be probably sticking with the default here, which is the 2.x, which is what we default to, because the last thing we want you to do is to do the whole sequence only to realize that your audio file is not going to work. You can then choose frames per second. Now, look, there are reasons. Most people would generally use 50 frames a second. It's generally speaking good enough, and most people don't notice it. There are some circumstances, there are some things that do look better. If you go for 40 frames a second, your fades will look better. You'll get more graduated color as the fades happen. They won't look as if they're stepping down. They'll fade a lot better. And singing faces timing can look a lot better at 40 frames a second. So some people choose to go 40 frames a second. In part, it depends on your controllers. Some controllers are very capable of dealing with 40 frames a second. Some of the older controllers can struggle, and you're probably better off with 20 frames a second. Generally speaking, basically 40 frames a second doubles the size of everything. It's double the number of channels that get saved in the file. It takes longer to render and so forth. So, yeah, I'm not one of those people that's particularly visually fussy. I think for 20 frames a second is more than adequate in 99% of situations, and so I generally go that way. But you may be much more fussy and choose 40 frames a second, and that's fine. You choose it here. You can change it later, but recognize that when you get down to sequencing, this is the minimum placement interval of effects. So if you sequence at 25 milliseconds and then move to 50, then everything that was on a 25 millisecond boundary that wasn't also a 50 millisecond boundary is going to have to move. So that's a disadvantage of changing later. There's also custom. Custom lets you do things like, if you want to approximate 30 frames a second or 29.97 frames a second or whatever, custom will let you sort of set some different frames per second. But understand at the end of the day, xLights actually doesn't work on frames per second. It works on milliseconds between frames. And so it's only going to be an approximation to a particular frame rate. These ones happen to be nicely dividable into 1,000, so you end up with a nice round number, but 30 frames a second doesn't nicely round, so it'll be close, but it won't be exact. Your info and media, so this is where it stores or shows you all your details about the song that you've chosen. If you want to change this to an animation after the fact, you would do it up here. If you'd set animation, you want to change the length of the animation from 30 seconds, you would do that here as well. And you can get to this via the settings menu and change all of this stuff later. So that's all good. The metadata is just pulled out of the MP3 file. Timings, you can predefine some timing marks here if you want to, or you can add them later. It doesn't really matter. I've installed the VAMP plugins. If you go back to the xLights page and back to the downloads, you'll see here that there are these VAMP plugins that you can install. There are equivalent ones for the Mac and I believe Linux as well. These plugins are basically audio analysis plugins. And so you can come down here, click New, and instead of just these top 4, which are normally the ones that are there, you've got all of these ones here, which are all music sensitive. And so you can come in here and say, look, I want you to mark up every bar in the song. And you click OK. Generally, I take the defaults here, and it will analyze the audio and it will generate a timing track which will mark out the bars in the music, and it's done through an audio analysis routine. And data layers is how you would generally bring in, maybe you've done a previous sequence in law and you want to bring in your LMS, well, one of the ways in which you can bring in your old law sequencing is using data layers, and you basically import them. I'm not going to go through that in a great deal of detail. At the end, if someone really wants to, look, I can bring in an LMS file or something, but I've never actually used law. I know enough to be dangerous. There are some reasonable videos out there. The challenge that we've got is a lot of the people that were motivated to make videos are the guys who have now been doing xLights for 4 or 5 years. And consequently, you don't see those people going back and updating their videos because they're actually quite removed these days from law and don't necessarily think that way. And so I would strongly suggest that those who are coming from law, think about it in 6 months' time or whatever. Maybe you want to be the one who publishes the updated video that says, hey, this is the best way to bring law in. It would make a lot of sense. But I will quickly run through how to do some imports shortly. Okay, when you're done, you click done, and up comes our sequence. There's our bars. It's put in timing marks, which are roughly lined up to where the bars are in the song based on that audio analysis. If you right click here, you can go back and add a timing track, and you can choose one of the other things in here. So I can choose metronome. I want to create a 5,000 millisecond, which is a 5-second metronome. So there's a metronome. It just marks out every 5 seconds. You can select between these and it just divides up everything into what we call cells. So each one of these things is a cell, and those things become quite important when it comes to sequencing with this AC toolbar. If you don't have cells, the AC toolbar ain't going to do a great deal. So that's why some people actually like to, and I don't generally advise it, but 50 milliseconds is obviously the minimum timing frame, and so some people like to bring in a 50 millisecond timing track. Now, this is insanely detailed, but you can do it. And some people who are used to sequencing in law or Vixen 2, they actually kind of like this because it's kind of very familiar territory for them. It just creates a huge number of timing marks, which is the only downside to it. In terms of the screen layout, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. This is the default. This is what comes up when you've default loaded xLights. There is one other option up here I would set, and that's go down to here to view perspectives, auto save, and I would click on that. And what that will do is every time you close xLights, it will remember how you've laid your screen out, and the next time you load it up, it will load it up. It's got an additional benefit that, when it comes time to import a sequence, if you were to go and grab, one of Logan's sequences or Ryan's xLights Around the World sequence from last year, when you open those sequences up by pointing to their show folders, you get their screen layout, which is generally speaking not the one that you'd want to have. And by doing the auto save, it will actually open their sequence up using your screen layout, which is a real benefit to have. So I strongly suggest you do that. The other things that we bring up here, this effect assist window, I generally close that. It's currently, I think, on auto pop-up, so it will pop up when it's relevant. I usually turn it off. It drives me nuts. I get rid of the jukebox unless you're using it. The jukebox, is a video out there explaining what that is. I'm not going into that. And I generally get rid of this effects window as well because everything I want is actually up here on the toolbar, and I prefer the toolbar. Your mileage may vary. You choose. And that's about it. I like to, because I am on a laptop here, you'll notice that this area here is quite small. That's because I'm on a laptop and I want to maximize my screen real estate. I tend to like to have my effects settings here because these things can get quite long and I like to be able to see them, and it also means I can drag this down a little bit. All right, and that's kind of how I like my screen layout. Now, in terms of views here, the master view is the order of the models as they are defined by default. This also represents the order in which the models are rendered. So when xLights does the rendering, it will start at the top here and it will render down the list until it gets to the bottom. And these are obviously all the models that we put into our display. Now, one of the things I didn't put in is I didn't create any groups. Well, that was a big oversight. So let's go back to our layout. And let's add some groups. Maybe we want a group, we want to put all of our trees in a group. And maybe we want a group which contains everything. And the way you would do that is you would come up here and you'd right click, add group. Let's add an all group. Oh, yes, that's a known bug. That's fixed in the next release. Sorry about that. Let's delete that. So we add an all group. So there's the all group there. And let's add a trees group. Care about names. All right, so now we've got two groups, and so the group is down here, and what we want to do is we want to add everything in. So I'll shift highlight everything and move everything across. So now everything is in the all group, and the trees group, I'm going to choose tree 1 and tree 2 only and put those into that group. And we'll save that layout. So now those models are in a group, and that allows me to do sequencing on them as if they're one thing, which is kind of nice. So let's go back to our sequencer. And the first thing you'll notice is those models or those groups aren't there. And that's because I've added them after I've created the sequence. But that's okay. I can right click here, edit display elements. And it will show me here, this is my master view, here are all the models that you can see in this list, and here are these two things over here that you can't see. And so again, I can grab these and drag them over here and put them in, and if I move it aside, you can see that it's put those models down here on the group. That's kind of annoying the way it docks. You'll find that happens a lot in xLights. If you hold the control key down when you drop it, it won't dock, which is kind of nice. So the other thing that you can do down here is you can click and drag these things and reorder them. There's also a right-click menu here which lets you sort them. One of the things that's kind of nice is to bubble the groups up to the top, so all the groups are on the top. You can sort them alphabetically and all sorts of things. We would generally recommend you do groups at the top, and I'll explain why in a minute. The other thing you can do up here is you can create views. So I can come up here and I can say, actually, I want a trees view, which I can't spell. And you can see now that the trees view here is empty. I'm going to want to, generally, you're going to want to put all your timing tracks back in. I'm going to get my trees and my tree groups, and I'm going to add all of those in as well. And I'm going to put my groups at the top. So we'll just bubble the groups up to the top. And so now I've got a view that just contains my trees. Now, when you've only got 3 elements, or sorry, when your master view has only got this many elements, it's neither here nor there. But once your show starts to get big, this becomes quite a long list, and you'll spend a great deal of time scrolling up and down here trying to find your models. And so one of the ways to make that easier is to create views. So you might create a singing elements view, you might create a, your trees view, your matrix view, etc., as a quick way to filter your models down to the things that you want to work on. Now, but understand that when it comes to rendering, the only order that matters is the master view. Now, the reason I put the groups at the top, and let me demonstrate this, is that let's do something. Let's do something like a butterfly, which just makes everything very colorful at the top. And if I come down and I was to throw a fire effect, actually, let's put a bars effect on my matrix, right? Because the matrix is below the all group, the matrix actually shows below it, shows or overrules it. I just realized there's an option I missed. So yeah, so this the bars effect renders over the top, and the reason is because the all is done first, the butterfly's laid down, and then the bars effect comes over the top and overwrites it. Now you'll notice that they actually blend together, and the reason they blend together is actually driven by go away. Sometimes the zoom toolbar gets in the way. There is this model blend setting. This is the default setting. I should have set this to off when I started, because model blending is something I generally want to turn off. But now that it's been set, I actually have to go into sequence settings, and I have to uncheck this allow blending between models, because I actually didn't want that. And by doing that, now the effect that's on another model, in this case the all group, doesn't merge with the effect that's on the spirals effect, and so the spirals effect is overlapping it. But if I was to go back into those display elements and I was to grab my matrix and move it above the all group, right, and I was to come back and click on this, notice that you can't see the spirals at all. And the reason you can't see the spirals is because it renders the spirals, and then it comes and it renders the butterfly, and because the butterfly is lower in the list, it just clobbers everything that was rendered up in the spirals. And that's why you can't see it, and that's why, generally speaking, people would put their groups at the top and their models below. Okay, so that's a tip for things that would otherwise cause you grief. Okay, so now dropping effects is literally as simple as coming down onto the timeline and dropping effects into place, but let's finish off on the screens here. So the model preview gives you a preview of the model that is holding the effect that you have currently got selected. In this case, I've got the matrix. If I was to drop an effect onto the polyline, it would show me the polyline. Okay, whichever effect I click on, that's the one it shows. The house preview is showing me the full house. By default, it's the 2D preview. If you want to see the 3D, you can see the 3D like so. If you want to choose that camera position that you really liked, you can do so as well by once again right-clicking. Let's go back to our sweet spot. You can also zoom in on this as well. You can move it around. All the same controls from the previous screen work. So you can see your show from any angle you want. You know, you want to watch your show from inside your mega tree, that's cool, you can do that. Just move it around the way you want to see it. So these are the visualizers, if you like. The main settings for each effect are contained here. But in reality, all of these settings on all of these 4 panels are all effect settings. Every setting that you set here affects just the one selected effect that you happen to have selected. So this is not, generic. It's not setting global settings. It's setting the settings on this particular effect. And that means you end up with just an unbelievable combination or number of permutations of settings that you could put in place. The settings themselves, it would take several hours, and in fact it did take several hours when we made videos walking through each of the effects. Again, I would refer you all the way back to the 2016 Oz Christmas lighting video series, where over a number of weeks we walked through all of the settings of all of the effects. The only things that series doesn't cover is some of the newer effects, and those effects, generally speaking, have their own launch videos, or they have a video that was produced. The release video for when that effect was produced is generally out there. So, if you want to look at the shapes effect, or the liquid effect, or the warp effect, those things generally have their own videos. I think the servo effect, which is really about controlling 16-bit servos, that's probably got its own one. The DMX effect, I'm pretty sure, got its own one as well. And so, yeah, seek those videos out. I'm not going to go through them exhaustively because it would just take way, way, way too much time. When you're looking at the effects, one of the best ways, in fact, the best way, bar none, and I'm going to just click the up arrow a few times here and move this effect up to my matrix, is to put an effect on a matrix. Because at the end of the day, every effect is rendering on a matrix. And so if you want to see what an effect actually is doing, putting it on a matrix is a great way to see what it's doing. And so this is the pinwheel effect, and it's got 3 arms, 4 arms, 5 arms spinning around. You can see it's red and white. Why is it red and white? Because we chose red and white. If we want everything to have a different color, we can do that by selecting more colors. If I want those arms to be really thick, I can make the arms really thick. It's all good. Right, it's really as simple as doing that. So you can play with the speeds, you can play with the thicknesses, you can twist it. You can change the size of it, which can make it smaller, and so forth. A whole bunch of settings if you want to make it rotate the other way, if you want it to have fading leading edges. There's a huge number of combinations here. You can also center it differently, and so forth. So a whole bunch of settings in here that you can set. Up here is the color panel. So the color panel lets you change the colors. You can choose one or more colors. Some effects will use as many as you can select. Some of them will only use one. Some of them, each color has a very, very particular meaning to it. So for instance, if you were to drop a piano, the color order is really important. The main key color is the first color selected. If I get rid of the white, now the red becomes the first color selected. So that's the key color. It's the same with singing faces. The order of the colors is quite important in terms of rendering the default face at least. But most effects, it will take the color in whatever order you happen to put it in. If you want to change a color, just click on it. Right? If you want that to be a blue color, change it to be a blue color, and I can make that the white color. It's all good. And if you like that particular color combination, come over here and save it. And now you've got that color order saved, and so you can always go back to it. So I can make other changes over here, make that green as well, and there's no reason why you can't have multiple the same color. And in fact, there are some circumstances where it's really useful to have several things the same color. Again, I can save it, and if I want to jump back to a previous color palette, I can do so, like so. These reset panels with changing effects, I would generally set those. You'll get in trouble otherwise. Sparkles allows you to just overlay some sparkles onto an effect. You then can control brightness and contrast, and there's a whole bunch of hue adjustments. Be careful with these can trap you. I've had people look at, they'll throw a spiral down on our matrix here. Right, so we're down to two colors, and they'll look at this and they'll say, I don't understand it. I've chosen red and blue, yet my spirals are green and purple. What the hell's going on here? And it's because they've played with this setting down here. If you set it back to 0, it actually keeps the colors honest. But these things are really, really cool when it comes to color changing videos and the like, which you couldn't do any other way. So that's that stuff. Let's talk about layer settings. So layer settings over here lets you do things like limit exactly how much. So if you want the piano to only occupy the bottom half of this, you can right click here and say halves, give me the bottom half, and now the piano effect only renders in the bottom half. I can move it around onside that grid. Right, so there's a whole bunch of sort of transformations and the like that you can do there. You can also come up to here, and by default, obviously, a matrix renders. If you double click on there, it resets to its default. But by default, the render style for something, and let's do this with a single strand effect. By default, it's a matrix, right? And so the single strand effect here is just sliding across. Let's increase the cycle so it goes a bit faster. Is just sliding across on a square matrix with the node layout that we saw back on the layout screen. But you can actually change the shape of the underlying render buffer. By default, there's this per preview, single line, and as a pixel. And what these things do is per preview says, look at the 2D representation. So go back to the layout here. Look at the 2D representation and then apply the effect as if you were just painting across these pixels as they are here. And so if you look at this tree here, which is called tree 2, this is going to show it quite well. So if I grab my single strand effect and if I drop it on tree 2, so by default, that's going around the tree because that's the shape of the buffer that it is. But if I come up here and say per preview, it looks entirely different. And why does it look entirely different? Well, because the tree is in real life on our layout rotated. It's not vertical. And so you get this different effect because it's actually drawing on the tree. It starts here, it draws across the tree until it gets to the top, and hence you get, if you were rotate that in your head, you get this diagonal line moving up the tree, and that's exactly what you get over here. So per preview is always the concept of looking at it as it is laid out on the 2D display and how the effect would look if you then painted across that effect. Single line is interesting because what single line does is it takes all the pixels and stretches them all out as if they were a long line of pixels. And so it's no longer a grid that is 50 by 16. It's now a grid that is one high and however many nodes were in the grid long. So you end up with this massively long buffer, and that creates a very different effect on it. This gets even more interesting once you start to get to model groups. Because model groups, sorry, one more. With model groups, you're now getting, now the default render buffer for model groups is actually per preview. And you can see this is like the 2D effect is sweeping across my entire 2D display. It's starting over here and it's sweeping its way all the way across. And if I maybe get that out of 3D mode, you can kind of see it here. It's a little bit more obvious about how that works. Now, there are also a bunch of others up here, however. Once you get into groups, you get a whole bunch of different things. The per model ones are particularly interesting. So per model applies the effect as if you dropped the effect onto each and every model individually. So it's like you've sequenced all the props individually, but in one place on the group. Per model, per preview, we'll do each prop as if it's a per preview. So our tree 2 here, we'll still, got to get better at this bloody center mouse. Oh, that's interesting. The y-axis is inverted. There's a bug. That's why it threw it out. But you can see here that the tree is rendering per preview as we discussed earlier, exactly how you'd expect it to be. But you can also stack them together, and there's a whole bunch of these. And the only thing I can suggest you do is you play with these things, because playing with them, you'll start to get a feeling for how they work. There was a great X Essentials presentation done last year that covered all of these different render buffer styles and talked about, provided a whole bunch of slideware that talked about, well, this is what this render buffer looks like, and this is what that render buffer looks like, and so forth. So there's all of that sort of stuff. But if we go back to 3D and we go and look at our overhead, what if I wanted to sweep the lights from front to back across my display? And that can also be done. Again, I'll take the sweep here. And what we can do is, if we go back to per preview, we can choose to actually use that camera position as the way in which it renders. And you can see at the moment it's still sweeping from left to right. We can rotate that. So now it's actually sweeping from front to back. And if I zoom in a little bit on this and I get this right, you can see how it starts at the front here and sweeps across the tree. And it respects the fact that it's on its side and twisted in a bizarre direction. And so if you were on a corner block and you wanted to have people be able to have it sweep from front to back here, right, you can now do that, and you can see how that works. Now, that was never possible in 2D. It is entirely impossible to do that with the old 2D mode. So it's one of those cool things that 3D does give you that 2D doesn't get. But it's not a hell of a lot of value if at the end of the day, everyone watches your house from here. So choose the one that is most appropriate to your particular circumstance. Okay, so that's the buffer settings here. There's also roto zoom. Roto zoom lets you spin buffers around and zoom stuff in and the like. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on that. There's also blur here. If I go back to default, and actually let's throw bars because it becomes a little bit more obvious. Sorry, didn't grab it. Blur basically blurs the bars together. It renders very slowly though once you start to get to high numbers. So generally I try and keep it pretty small most of the time. Okay, then you get to layer blending, which is our last major panel here. And to be honest, layer blending only comes into play if you've got layers. Oh, that's actually not true. You've got the in and out transitions. So if with this bars effect here, which is probably going a little bit long, it runs for 6 seconds. If I wanted this to fade out over the last 3 seconds of the 5.1 seconds that it runs for, I can come up to here and say a fade out time of 3 seconds, and the bars effect will occur and it will slowly fade to black. You also have in transitions, so I can fade it in over 1 second, it plays, and then it fades out slowly. And so you can do those sorts of things here. There's a whole bunch of different transitions. You can do a clock transition, which will wipe around like a clock to bring the effect into play. There's a whole bunch of these transitions that you can play with. But up the top here, you have the actual blending of effects. And this is where you can actually have multiple effects on a same prop at the same time. And you do that by creating layers, and you can add layers above or below or add multiple layers. And these layers on a single effect will always blend together. Now, unlike models, which we talked about rendering from top to bottom, layers are like paint. They come from bottom to top. And so we can take something like a butterfly and lay it down here. And then we can say, I want to take a fire effect and lay the fire effect over the top of it. And you can see by default here, it's put the butterfly down and then it's painted the fire on top of it. And wherever the fire didn't paint anything, you can still see the butterfly effect underneath it. And that's just the default way in which these two layers are blended together. But you can control how they blend together, and that's done using these layer blending styles. And so you can do things like use it as an unmask. And so wherever the fire effect is not black, show through the butterfly. But where it was black, then don't show anything through it all. So now we've got a butterfly with a fire effect as the edge. You can make a tool mask. It's not going to work. You can do additive. Additive's probably not great. Maybe we'll do subtractive. So now what that's happening is the fire effect is subtracting its colors from the butterfly effect. So the fire effect is generally red and yellow. So the bottom area of the picture here, all the red and yellow has been subtracted from the underlying layer. So again, there's a huge number of these. Again, there are videos out there. There was an X Essentials video that went through it. I know Clyde Lindsay's done a bunch of stuff, which is quite good on how all of these things come together. Play with them. You can get some really, really neat effects. Very different effects, and often when you look at someone's effect and you say, well, how did they do that? It's going to be some bizarre combination of layers that gave them the ability to do something. And once you've found an effect that you like, maybe you think, hey, I want to use that at another time, you can then come in and say, well, let's select these two effects and I want to make this a preset. And so there's this effect preset menu here. And you can come in and say, create a new reset, and this is my bizarre fire. And you can save it. Click OK. And later on, you can come down here and you can say, oh, I want to apply that onto my star. I'll insert a layer below, and I'll go to my effect presets. And I open it up, there's my fire, and if I double click on it, it will place a copy of it there. So if you find some effects that you really like, you can put it in there. You can also export them and import them. So I have some presets here. Here's a laces preset. This was one that was shared by Steve Giron, I believe. And so I can come down to my tree, because that's one of the things, sorry, that the laces effect looks really good on. If I look at this, it says that this 8 here tells me that it needs 8 layers, but I've only got 1 on my tree, so I better go and insert an additional 7 layers, or otherwise when I bring it in, it's not going to be right. And so then I can double click on it and then click on my laces, and there's the laces, which looks kind of cool. It's an effect I could use. Now, if I go back to my layout, which tree did I put it on? Tree. Tree. This one here. Let's say that I decided that I was going to make this now 100 pixels per string. My tree is going to get a bit bigger. Now, if I go back to my sequencer and I click on the effect, it's automatically adjusted. Didn't have to do anything. Now, you might find that because it got bigger, you might want to play with some of these things, but it's up to you. Now, what if I want to what if I want to change all of them? What if I want all of them to fade out? Well, they do. Do they fade out? Well, they don't fade out. Let's imagine I want them to fade in rather than that. And so I'd have to go up here and select each effect and set the fade in time. One of the cool things that you can do is you can select all the effects. You can come up here to the fade in time, and if you right click on this, there's a bulk edit option. And so I can come in and say, I actually want to fade that in over 1 second. Okay, and so now all of those effects, if you click on them, have all had their fade in time set to 1 second. Almost everything here has bulk edit. So if I was to grab those 2 butterflies and I was to right click here and bulk edit, I'll change the style to 2. So now this one is style 2 and this one here is style 2 as well. You can select, so because when I selected that, I actually selected the fire effect as well, but because I was changing a butterfly setting, the bars effect obviously didn't care. Whereas if I change, let's come back to that one. If I change the brightness and set it down, then obviously that also impacts on the fire effect because that's a setting that the fire effect recognizes. Now you can do it with subbuffers as well. It's a little bit different. With subbuffers, what you would do is you would choose a particular effect. You would say, hey, I want that on the left third, and then you would control click on the other effects. Oh, hang on, and go back to this one. That was not what I wanted to do. And control click again. You need to make sure that this buffer is set where it's the third. So you need to make it the last effect you click on. And then if I right click here and go apply selected effects, it will now apply that buffer onto all of them. So it's a bulk edit as well. So that's how you bulk edit and sequence. Now, how to sequence? That's a much more time-consuming activity. Let's briefly touch on the AC toolbar. The AC toolbar, if you double-click here, I just double-clicked on that, you can open models up. You can see their strands and their submodels and things. I think we got rid of all of our submodels, but if our submodels were there, they would show up here, which is how you would sequence on those. But in the case of channel blocks, you have the 16 channels that I've defined here. If you wanted to do, let's imagine this was connected up to a 16-channel law controller and you wanted to sequence those. By far the easiest way to do that is you go and choose a particular type of timing track, which gives you the right separation. You come up to the AC toolbar and you click on AC, and then you decide, well, what sort of thing do I want to do? I want to turn them on. I just want to steady on. And I can come down here and click and drag and it will turn things on. I can come up here and say, actually, no, I want them to be ramps from 0 to 100 down, and that will do the fades for you wherever you drag and drop. If you don't want it to be an on, you want it to be a shimmer, you can click the shimmer here, make sure it's all on. If I click and drag, it drops the shimmer down. and it will shimmer that particular thing. So yeah, that's how you would do the AC ramps. You can also do some cool things. So let's get rid of all of this. Let's say I want a ramp down, and so I do it like this. And let's say I now want to cascade that across the channels. So one of the things I can do is I can choose the cascade tool here. I select the area that I want to cascade, how far I want to cascade it for, and it will cascade it down like so. So yeah, there's cascade tools, there's fill tools, all the tools that you were used to in law. They may not always work exactly the same way, but they largely work the same way. There is in the view menu the ability, if you find it a little bit easier to see them as ramps, to show these things as ramps. Something that you may want to do. It depends on how you like to view it. You can choose either way. Interestingly, the cascade also works on non-AC elements. So in AC mode here, I can actually come up here and cascade out. Oh, I wasn't in cascade mode. That doesn't help. If I go back to cascade mode, I can actually cascade out this effect, and it will cascade out a normal LED effect. And to get out of AC mode, you click the AC toolbar again, and you're back in regular sequencing mode. And you'll see that these effects are actually just on effects or shimmer effects or whatever else it is that you happen to be sequencing with. So yeah, that's AC mode. Where else have we got? We should talk a little bit about importing. If you go to sequence setting, data layer, let's say I want to do an import here. I need an LMS file. I think I've got an LMS file. Yeah, I don't really know what's in these files. There's a set of options here. All off at the end just forces all the data to be 0 at the end. These ones here, I'm less sure about, to be honest. Let's check them. It brings them in. There was only 8 channels in this particular file. It goes for 3 seconds. Done. Now, you can't actually see that data here. You will see nothing at all, but it has brought it in. It's just what's called a data layer, which happens to have been imported onto my channel block. And so if I come down to my channel block and I zoom in, actually I'll need to click render. Sorry, this is the render all button up here. If someone asks you to render all, it's that button there. Is there any data? There was no data. I got to say, I don't actually know what was in those files. So they haven't come in. But what it has done is it has brought it in as a data layer down here. Actually, the reason is, I think I have to move it up and render again. Is that it? No, it's not it. Oh, could be this data here. I'm not sure. It's probably easy to do it. Look, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it, but there is ways to do that. The more common thing to do, of course, is to import things like Superstar or other x-lite sequences, of which people have shared a huge number, and that's done via the import menu. You can also bring in law this way. In some ways, this is a better way of bringing law in because I can see it, but it's a little bit inefficient in that it creates thousands and thousands of effects. You will need to choose the type of thing that you are going to be bringing in. In this case, I have a I thought I had a superstar sequence. Maybe I don't. All right. Now I don't know what put in the folder? Hang on, let me have a look. Okay, I put in a bunch of let's do it again, the clean sequence. Matrix, candy cane was arches, and star was on star. And as you can see, actually, the bulk of it was just on the matrix. You can see it's brought the effects in and placed them there based on what was in the law pixel editor. Now this is just a test, so there's not anything exciting in this sequence. It gets more exciting if you start to import someone's sequence. Now, if you're going to import an xLight sequence, just give me 1 second. What I'll do, let me go into my lights. Home. All right, so here's a sequence that I've previously zipped up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a copy of that. I'm going to go back into my folder here, into my show folder, go into my imported folder, and I will put it there. I'm going to unzip that file. Okay, so there it is there. And you can see this is a copy of some selected things out of my show folder. It's got my layout and everything else. Now, if I'm going to import this sequence into my new layout, there's a couple of things that I need to do. And the first thing I need to do is close this sequence. I need to go back to my setup. And the first thing I need to do is change my show folder to that show folder, which is in imported Christmas Can home. This is the show folder that I just got from my actual show, and I need to select it. I don't care about saving that. All right. So this is the show folder that the particular sequence that we're about to import was created for. And so the first thing that I need to do is open that sequence up. Now, I can now render this and play it. It actually doesn't take long to render. So the first thing you would do is you would render it and you would play it and you would validate that actually that this does look correct and you can see what everything's doing, etc. I'm not going to do that now because I don't really want any music in this audio, in this video. But that's what you would do. You would generally, you'd play it and validate that everything looks okay. The next thing that you do, and I cannot emphasize how important this is you save it. You must save it, because if you don't save it, you're in for a world of hurt later on. Now, having saved it, I can now go back to the setup and I can change this back to my show folder. So that's this one here. I don't need to save the layout settings there, and I go back to my show. And so this is the show layout that we've been playing with. I come to the sequencer. There's nothing here. So now what we need to do is we need to create the new sequence. Now, normally you'd choose the audio track, etc., but I'm just going to create an animation because it's easier. And now we'd go up and we do an import. This one here is an xLights sequence. So as an xLights sequence, we would choose the XML file. We need to go into the right show folder. Well, this is the right show folder. There it is. And we would choose the sequence file that we're going to import. And we click open. And now what we get is we get a list of all the models and our models. Now, a couple of things to note here. This is not all the models in my show. This is all the models in my show that this particular song had sequenced effects on. And so it's a subset of all of my models. Up here are all of my timing tracks. Generally speaking, you would bring all the timing tracks in, particularly the voice tracks, because if you've got any singing faces, you're going to need them. The next thing that you'd want to do is do the mapping. And the mapping is as simple as going and finding the right elements to bring it across. So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here. So it looks like there's a group here called stars. You can actually map it to two things if you really wanted to. We probably won't. All arches, bauble outlines, arches. Yeah, maybe we'll put our arches onto our arches there. There's a matrix. We probably want to put the matrix onto the matrix. And the rest is, well, there's nothing else is really obvious, right? There's no all group or anything else. And so we're going to need to get a little bit creative. So maybe the house outline should go onto my polyline. In fact, maybe it should go on both of my polylines. My trees. Now, there are trees. There's a present. Pixels less matrix. That's my alls. So let's throw that on the all group. And you can see that you've got to kind of know what someone's show looks like. So you're probably going to want to spend a bit of time looking through their stuff to work out exactly where everything should be. Actually, this line elements is probably better than my house outline. Let's stick it at that. All right. Now, typically what you would do now is you would save the mapping and you'd call this my, you know, this might be my can map, or this might be my Keith map, because I've got this sequence off Keith and I know this has got all of his elements and how I decided to map them for this song. And that way you can reuse it. And you can see it's brought everything in. So here are all of our timing tracks. I can double click on these lyrics and hide them down, make it get a little bit of room. And you can see it's brought all of my effects in onto all of my elements. At this point, you'll need to render. And the reason you'll need to render is because it doesn't render automatically. And if I was to play this song, which doesn't matter now because there's no audio, it will play quite happily. Let's get it out of 3D. Whoa. Right, and the various elements will display. There's actually a snowman on there, although here's a problem. So here's a problem. There is no snowman. There's meant to be a snowman who's singing on here. And the reason that's happening is because I don't have a face defined on that matrix. So we'll go back to our layout here. We'll go into our faces. We did this earlier, remember? We've got a thing called snowman already. We'll download the images, go to the snowman. We'll grab him, he looks good. Click OK. Go back to our sequencer. We can click render all, or we can just click on the effect. And there he is. Okay, he's a little bit big for that matrix, but you can see the face has come in. And as he starts to sing, which he doesn't until about here, his mouth will start to move, but because of his resolution, obviously you can't see it. I needed to choose a slightly different face image that was maybe a little bit lower resolution, but yeah, I can prove that. Maybe if I change that to 40 strings high, go back to sequencer, click on him. Yeah, now you can see him. And you can see his mouth's moving as he sings. And it's really as easy as that to bring in someone else's sequence. So that's importing. Downloading sequences. Under the tools menu, there is actually download sequences and lyrics. Again, there's an online repository of these things. The Google Drive, there's links to the Google Drive down here if you want to go to it. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, not just sequences, that you can go and freely access. Some things have passwords. If there's a password, the password's xLights. But you can come into here and you can choose any one of these songs. Someone somewhere has sequenced it, made it available. Generally, the audio tracks aren't included. You'll need to go and find the audio track. It will typically it will often tell something. Okay, in this case, there is music in the download, but there's no music link in this one. So the assumption is that you will go and find this song, Appalachian Snowfall, and so forth. There's also the xLights Singing Faces project for those people that participated last year, or those people that participate this year. Once they kick it off in the next month or so, you can gain or find the various sequences there and download those things. So a way to kickstart yourself. A lot of people do find sequencing difficult, and it can be a great way to learn how to sequence by looking at how other people have sequenced, particularly if you find people that are using multiple layers and blending things together in weird and wonderful ways. The other thing, package logs. If you want to share your sequence, the way to share your sequence is actually with this package sequence menu item. There are a couple of settings here where you may want to choose to exclude audio and exclude presets from something that you package. Presets, maybe your presets you bought from someone else and you shouldn't be sharing them, so you should be excluding them. And generally you'd exclude audio because obviously there are copyright implications and you generally shouldn't be sharing audio files. You should be just indicating where people can go and acquire the audio. The only other tool here that's kind of useful is if you're an FPP user, you'll get familiar with this FPP Connect tool. Dan recently made a video on some major changes that came out in .4 around that, which enable you to use some more advanced ways to upload to either one or more pies, and so you're going to want to get involved in that. But again, that's a November, October, September type thing generally. Most of you will test and run your stuff just directly out of xLights for the next couple of months as you start to get your stuff going. And that's about it. I didn't want to spend a great deal of time on, I mean, there's a thousand other things in here. There's a huge number of videos on videos.xlights.org. You could spend the rest of the year watching them, coming up to speed. There are a couple other things though that I will point you to and leave you with before I take maybe a handful of questions. First of all, on xLights here, there is these tips of the day. This was a series of 100 tips that were written. I don't know if it goes all the way to 100 on here. And someone actually did package them all up in a document where, a whole bunch of sort of random facts and tips. Most of them are still as valid as they were then as they are today. I guess there might be a handful that we need to go through and revise, but they're an interesting thing. We talked about the 101 manual. You absolutely want to take a look at that, particularly if you're new to the hobby. Even if you're not, it's a useful reference guide. Jump into Zoom. You'll find this room is pretty much occupied all weekend, most weekends, and most evenings. It'll vary over the course of the year. There'll be quiet periods where maybe there won't be, but there's often people in here, and people are always willing to lend a hand. In terms of the videos, a couple of things, I guess. Videos.xlights.org is a great place because we've brought all the videos together. My YouTube channel is where I publish the videos. So all the release update videos come out here. So, they don't typically cover every release. What happens is you get a range of releases. So this one covers from 2018.54.3, and I'll walk through each and every enhancement that went into xLights in those things. And then occasionally you'll get videos like this one here, which talk about one specific feature. They're generally a lot shorter. And just focusing on one particular new thing. Every now and then you'll get these seminars. So if you want to go back and watch the September seminar, here it is. It's down here. And these go back quite some time. There literally are hundreds of them in there. If you subscribe, obviously you'll get notified, as YouTube ever does, when something comes out. Other places on YouTube, I think Jeff Lacey does a great job. He runs a channel called Can a Spade a Christmas. He says, not being there, he is. He's gone off the reservation in the last couple of videos. He's talking about batteries, but he over the last year he's made a massive number of videos on all sorts of stuff. And this is not x-lite specific. He does a whole bunch of hardware type stuff. He does a bunch of good stuff on the Pi, and he's got a great style, and he has a lot of fun making them. And yeah, strongly recommend his videos. And I'm sure once he's got his Powerwall up and running, we'll see a few more from Jeff covering some new things. The other series is, of course, X Essentials. The best way to find X Essentials is on the xLights video page, and you can tell the X Essentials videos because they're, they've got this sort of background to them. X Essentials, and there's like 27 or so. There's a whole swag of these. These are made on a Wednesday night. I think they're going to continue to get made on Wednesday night. Ed's already published a schedule that covers a fair proportion of the year of the various subjects that are going to go over. It's not just lighting. It does, projection and smoke machines and all sorts of stuff. So a great video series to get in and watch. And if you're new to the hobby and you haven't seen them before, I can't recommend those enough. In terms of xLights videos, this at the moment is probably the definitive version on bringing an xLight sequence in and how to do it. It talks through the steps very, very in a very sort of precise way, and if you follow those steps you will get good results. If you don't follow those steps you'll have the problems that we often see in the forum. This one here goes into the AC light sequencing in a lot of detail. Configuring Falcon controllers, this goes into the upload. I do need to upload this, update this video though, because some things have changed. And cleaning up your xLight setup and layout. So if you're an old school guy who's been doing absolute and this whole new start channel, universe start channel thing is something that you think you want to move to get out of renumbering hell, this is the video that you want to go and watch because it kind of explains that. The other one is if you're brand new to the hobby and you're wondering, well, which decisions should I make, etc., etc. There's a video that I made just before Christmas, which now I can't see. It'll be up here. Yeah, it's mid-November and I want to create an animated Christmas display. Well, it's not mid-November now. You've got a lot more time and you can choose to ignore some of the advice in it. It does steer you towards some of the better decisions that you might make around how to do things. So it's also definitely worth a watch, even though it's no longer mid-November. So that's kind of a quick intro to some videos. Obviously, it's been a whirlwind tour, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of questions that you still have, and I'll hang around for a little while and answer those and take questions. But it's a learning experience. You shouldn't expect to be able to do all of this on day one. It will take time, but it's an incredibly fun hobby. It's incredibly time consuming. It costs way too much, but all good hobbies do. And I hope you enjoy it, and I hope come late October maybe, or maybe early December, you've got a show up and running and you've got a whole bunch of neighbours around really enjoying your efforts, and a whole bunch of kids dancing on your front lawn. So thanks, guys. So I will take questions.
Keith, is it worth mentioning about the minis, the mini expo displays that we do?
Sure. So, and this is true around the world. And again, Ed Smith had a Facebook post which everyone responded to flagging these. But around the world, in a city, typically within a couple of 100 miles of you, there is almost certainly at some time this year a Christmas mini or gathering. Sometimes they've got different names. Where you can go along and gather together with a group of people who are typically, like I said, within a few 100 miles of you, who are interested in the same thing. It's a great place to get your hands on and touch controllers and see the pixels and talk to people who have had real world experience with things. My personal view is I don't buy any hardware until after I've gone to the mini each year, because I always walk away with good ideas and new ideas. And so I find the only challenge with it is the timing. They're spread out over the year. Most occur Most occur before June, July. But you know, that's not universally true. And if you don't have a local one, or yours is later in the year, you may not be comfortable waiting until then. It's a little less true than it used to be, given how much information these days is available, and how easy it is to pop in and ask questions. You're always going to get different advice from different people, right? There are always going to be, you know, that post that talks about which controller to use, and, you know, the people that want to use SAN devices or Falcon or AlphaPix or whatever else, and there's always going to be differing views. The reality is there's very few decisions that just will fundamentally not work. And but there are some. And, you know, if you've gone out and bought a T1000S from your Chinese vendor, right, there is a round thing outside your front door or down the side of your house that you should use for that, because it's a piece of crap and it needs to go in the bin. Right. But, you know, if you've chosen an AlphaPix, it may not be a controller that I've used. It might not be a controller that can control 1,000 pixels per port, but it will work. It will drive pixels. You know, you'll have to manually configure it because there's no way to upload to it, but it will work. So, you know, you don't need to get all worked up about, well, you know, oh, I made the wrong decision, I bought the wrong thing, unless, of course, you bought that T1000S and it's now in the bottom of your bin. But the minis are a great thing. There's lots of presentations, and also encourage people to recognize that, look, if you've been doing this for a year or two, you've got value to add in presenting to the community. I think, you know, I think the community's exploded over the last couple of years, but the one thing that I think is the saddest about what's happened is that it's become overly dominated by people that have been doing it for a long time. And what that's led to is a lack of appreciation for just how hard it is to use this stuff for the first time and come at it with, you know, fresh new eyes and not knowing stuff. And so, you know, if you're new at it and you stick at this thing for a year or two, please stick your hand up and, you know, volunteer to present in X Essentials and say, hey, I've only been doing it for a year, but I'd love to present about what it was like doing it for a year, because I bet you there are a bunch of newbies out there who are thinking, God, where is the video from the person who understands what it's like to be me, hasn't been using these controllers for the last 6 years, doesn't know what a universe is, doesn't use a bunch of examples with a bunch of jargon that just makes no sense to me. So step up and, you know, volunteer. And I'm sure Ed will find a way to squeeze you in, even if he has to bump someone, in order to get that experience out there, because it's valuable.
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
Say, for example, you've got two people that are working on a sequence. One person likes the 3D, the other doesn't, and they're on different computers. Could you just save the RGB effects after you totally design your layout and everything?
No. Well, so you obviously have the option of checking or not checking the 3D box, but what you can't do is lay your models out differently. So he can't lay everything out so that it looks good in 3D, and you lay everything out so it looks good in 2D. Because while when you drop an individual effect on an individual model and you use the default buffer, it won't make any difference. Anytime you use something that's per preview, it's going to make a difference, particularly if he uses per preview 2D, etc. It's just going to render totally differently. And when you come together, you know, one of you is not going to be happy because all of those effects that you've laboriously slaved over and made it look great now look like crap. So yeah, my recommendation is don't make life hard for yourself. One of you is going to have to lose the coin toss, and you're going to have to pick one. But if you're happy, if you're happy for the models, if you're saying, look, I'm happy to sequence it like this because this is 2D, and I'm happy to sequence it this way, and you don't move anything around, but he looks at it and he sees this and says, well, this is right, this is what I want to see. As long as you don't move anything around, it's fine. You can choose to look at it differently. You just can't move it around. Once you start moving it around, it starts to have impacts.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense.
So Keith, how will that affect importing other people's sequences down the road, like towards the end of the year when we do a mass sequence for everybody?
Again, it comes down to, look, even when you're in 3D mode, you can still drop effects and render in 2D. The challenge is the view that you're looking at when you're in 2D mode is this view here, right? You're as far back as you can go and you're looking at the whole house from this direction. That's how 2D renders. It's going to come in if people have done some effect where, you know, oh, this effect has to be viewed from the top of the tree looking down in order to look good, and you know they've done that in 3D and you bring it into 2D, it's going to look like it's front on the middle of the tree, and that's how it's going to import in, and so it won't come in as designed. But you know when you do an import, right? It's still universally true that while an import is a great way to get a head start on a sequence, there's not many people who take what's imported and say, I'm done, that's it, it's all good. Everyone fine-tunes things. Everyone goes through it and says, well, yeah, it's okay, but I want to do this and I want to do that, right? You know, Ryan did an amazing job on the xLights around the world sequence, but he's singing faces because he'd used a matrix singing face and he'd done a bit of roto zoom on it. When I brought those singing faces onto my singing faces, which were singing trees, they didn't even work. Right. You know, you always need to fine tune things because their layout's not your layout and you need to adapt things, and the same will be true. It just means that there might be a few more situations that you have to do than there have been previously.
Keith, what's the best way to donate to the xLights community?
To the community? The community is all about participation, right? So if you want to get involved, if you would like to add value in whatever way it is that you can add value, yeah, there's a whole bunch of ways you can do it. You know, no one died and made someone king or decided that this person would have control over that. Invariably, what happened was someone decided that, hey, I think I could add an enormous amount of value by doing something. They invariably reached out to a few people and had a conversation and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? How might I do it, etc. And then we got projects like, you know, the Singing Faces project. You know, no one told Steve Giron that, hey, you are officially anointed to run xLight around the world. It was something he wanted to do. It was an idea. He threw it out there. A bunch of people said, hey, that sounds great. Let's go do it. If you want to help get the manual up to date, if you want to make videos, if you want to do whatever, you know, you don't have to ask for permission. You just can get involved. If you want to present at X Essentials, right? Ed's always looking for people who have got something new or interesting or different to present. You know, he doesn't just want to rehash the old ground over and over again, unless things have changed dramatically, in which case maybe it doesn't make sense to go back and say, let's redo this, etc. So yeah, there are lots of ways that people contribute back to the community. I think, you know, sitting there and always just sort of being in the background, etc., is not necessary. You know, there are lots of ways to participate, and one of the great ways to participate and to sort of, you know, get a voice is to jump into the Zoom calls and, you know, ask questions and express opinions and share your experiences, and don't let yourself get talked down by the people that are just loud because they're loud. Yeah, that's not necessary.
I've managed to set up in the layout, most of my layout. The bit I'm struggling with is I'm converting from Linorama, and I've got 4 8-channel trees where the eyes and the mouth are like, how do I draw those? Is there an easy way to do that?
Yeah, we did go over that, but look, basically what you want to do is you want to, let's get out of damn 3D.
I can watch the video back if that's easier, if you've covered it.
I'll cover it briefly again, just for those that didn't catch it the first time. Oh, I missed my custom model. So you want to use a custom model to draw your trees. So you come in here. You're going to want a grid that's big enough to display your whole model. Make it 50 by 50, that'll do. And now what you need to do is draw your face. And because yours is an 8-channel model, what you want to do is come up over here, click on active, but don't click on auto increment. And let's imagine your left eye is channel 1. So let's just draw our left eye. And because it's at the end of the day dumb, it doesn't really matter where these are as long as it's lined up. Now you can put an image behind this. If you click here, browse, you can bring up an image. So, you know, I can come into images. No. Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Let's imagine I'm doing this policeman.
Yeah.
Right. So I can come into here. Highlight all of that. We'll delete that. Sorry. There's no easy delete. And let's imagine that his uniform was all channel 1. So I can come into here to channel 1 and I can just come around and click. Oh, that doesn't help. Accidentally made that row big. And I can just come around and click on all of these and make these channel 1s. And that will be channel 1 on my 8-channel controller.
Yep.
Right, well, channel 1 from the start channel, so wherever I set the start channel to be. So come around. I'm getting looser and looser as I go along. I'm getting very loose. All right, and then you come along and you might say, well, look, his hat is number 2. So you increase this to 2 and you come around and you do his hat. Right, and when you sequence it, right, that will be channel 2 and so forth. And if you were doing a face, you would do different parts of the face or the mouth, etc., with different channels going up until you finally got up to channel 8. Yeah, I don't know, maybe his shoes are channel 8. Right, and then when it comes time to sequence it, that's one thing I think we need to fix, the way the models keep on changing size. Yeah, when it comes time to sequence it, you then come into the faces. And in the case of those faces, you'd use a single node thing and you'd say, well, look, you know, his face outline, that's node 1. The bottom of his mouth, that's node 2. Oh, and this AI one, well, that's actually nodes 1, and hold the control key down in node 8. All right, and that's how you would describe the face. And so, yeah, the outline and all the mouth shapes and so forth. And then you just use the face effect to sequence it, and you're done.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Justin. I'm new, so pardon my ignorance here. I went ahead and brought my house into 3D, and I have my measurements in SketchUp so that I can figure out exactly how many pixels I need lengthwise on, say, a roof line. Now, inside of xLights, is there a way when you're drawing your prop length that you can figure out how many lights you need? Does it show footage or inches or anything?
No. xLights has no, there are no units of measure, right? When I sit here and I click on a prop and you come down here to the sizes and it says it's 239, right? That's 239 thingamawodgy units, right? It means nothing. Yeah, any measurements, etc. Now, can you come up with a scale? Sure, you could, but xLights doesn't. xLights just, you know, at the end of the day, as long as it renders correctly, that's kind of all we're worried about. Everything else is eye candy.
Would you suggest to buy longer and cut?
It depends. You say you're doing outlines on your house. How are you mounting them?
That's to be determined. I mean, it could be, let's say, Boscoyo strips or something of that
Right.
nature, or
So
PVC
now,
square
but now,
netted something.
okay, but now what you're doing is you're saying, okay, so I'm going to buy some. Let's say I'm going to buy some chroma trim or something. Okay, so you're going to put them on 3-inch centers or 4-inch centers or 2-inch centers. What are you going to do?
Probably 2-inch.
Well, then you know how long it is. Just multiply it, divide it by 2 inches and add 1, and that's how many nodes you're going to need.
All right, good deal. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need xLights to do that sort of stuff for you if you know how long it is. I would always buy slightly more and chop them off at the end. You know, some people like to get the vendors to actually make everything up for them, and if that's you, that's you. But obviously, you need to go and get everything right then in those circumstances. Whereas, you know, my tendency is I just buy a bunch of pixels, and I don't mind doing a bit of solder and throw a couple of pigtails on. It's not hard, but you'll always want to have a few spares, because although nodes are pretty good and pretty reliable, I think I've replaced 2 in an entire history on this tree here, and this tree is like 6 or 7 years old. They do occasionally go out, and you will need to replace them, and you will want to have ideally pixels from the original batch to replace them with.
Perfect. Thank you.
Keith, along that line of replacing pixels, if you have one go bad, do you just replace that pixel, or you replace the one in front of it also?
To be honest, I just replace the pixel. You know, the way I look at it is there's a chance that the pixel before it's bad as well. But, you know, if it's bad, I'll go and cut it out next. I mean, I don't mind doing it. It's only 6 more solder joints, right? And it doesn't happen that often. You know, if you want to be conservative and say, look, I don't want to be making, 9 solder joints when I could just make 6, then fine, cut 2 out and just replace the 2. If you say, look, I'm willing to wear the risk that I might have to do 6 more, then just replace the 1 and recognize that it may not work and you might have to go back and cut out the other. What won't happen is the fact that the previous one was dead will not break the new one that you put in. It's not like something's going to damage it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a question about, has anybody, you or anybody that you know, have ever used the xLights to program rings that are chained together to create effects? I've got some that I have done with Superstar, but I have struggled with trying to figure out how to do that in xLights.
I mean, it again, right? It comes down to all Superstar represents those rings is probably as a matrix, right? Where one of the dimensions is the number of rings and the other dimension is the number of lights in each ring. Is that right?
I don't know. I mean, it just shows up as a circle of however many number of lights I tell it to, and you do have a circle, fixture choice here, or
well, you do have the circle fixture choice, and you can create one circle or you can create multiple circles.
Side by side, but not inside of each other.
Do you want to put them side by side? You can do side by side. You just create multiple.
Yeah,
so, but if you want to put them inside of each other, that's cool. So how many have you got?
No, not inside of each other, just side by side. I've got 4 of them that go along, and I do some things where they kind of squiggle around in and out around each other, and I'm not sure how to actually sequence that in xLights.
Well,
I can figure out how to build it into the the graphic there, but not necessarily how to sequence it.
Well, the first thing I'd do is I'd create my 4 circles.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing I would do is I'd highlight them and I'd create a group. Okay, so now I've got a group which contains the circles and they seem to be in the right order, which does kind of matter. Okay, so now let's go and create a new sequence based on them. All right, so what do you want them to do?
Well, I'd like them to do like figure 8s.
A figure 8. Okay.
Figure 8s that kind of.
All right. So, all right, we're gonna have to get a little bit creative here, but that's okay. So, It's single strand, so single strand 2. Okay, so that goes around, right? Which is great. If I just want to do this. Oh, that's not going to work, sorry. Halves, left half. No, that's not going to work either. Where do you start the wiring from? Do you start from the bottom?
Actually, no, it started from the left side.
Left side middle.
Left side.
side.
In the middle.
Left side in the middle. So I don't think that is a wiring option.
Maybe you can
Bottom.
flip it.
I can rotate it. I can absolutely rotate it like that. Right, but here's the thing you're going to need to understand when you come time to sequence this, right? Because, and I'll show you this will illustrate it pretty well.
That used to be a superstar attribute.
Right, so when I go back into the sequencer here and I put thing on it, right? Let's go back to 2D and we'll zoom in. That is going to really annoy me. I have to fix that. So you can see how it's doing the top half, but up here it's doing the left half. And the reason is because this one here, this window here, always shows the model non-rotated, whereas this is showing the model actually rotated. Although in your circumstance, you actually want the top half. No, that, well, which is the top half. So that's right. That's what you want. That's how it's wired. Okay, and then you're going to want to do what, the bottom of circle 2, is that, or circle 3 is going to be next?
Yeah, but it would be going in the other direction. And then as it gets to the other
direction. No, it's going to go down. It's going to go down the bottom. Yeah. So let's make this a little bit easier on ourselves. Let's add a metronome, and we'll make it 1 second so that it's easier to do this. All right. So let's go in. All right, so there's circle 1 doing the top half. So the next thing we need to do is we need to drop a single strand onto circle 2. Okay, the problem is that's in the top half and that's not what we want. So what we want is we want the right half of this. And now it's backwards. We don't want that either. So we need to flip it around.
Okay.
Rotate it 180. Half, left half. Okay, that looks about right. And then the next one. So the next one is going to be that one again, but on circle 4. And then the next one is going to be that one again on circle 5.
How'd you do that?
Okay, and I just push Control C and Control V. I'm just doing copy and paste.
I know, but it was changing the different locations, like getting closer. You know what I'm saying? I mean.
Okay, so now, so it comes across, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, which is exactly what you wanted, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so now we need to come back, right? So the next thing we need to do is we need to go all the way around this one. Yeah. So what we need to do is, again, we need to Control paste, okay? And this time we want to do the other side. That's the right half. Okay, well that looks right, so that's good. So we're going to want that one there, and we're probably going to want that one there as well. And then the next one we're going to need something on here. And this one here is doing the wrong way again. So here we're going to want to not rotate it. That looks good.
1, 2, 3, 4. So they're on different lines. That's why it's making it.
And then we go on to that one. It's on different models, yeah. So now when we play it, it goes over, under, over, backwards, under, backwards, over, backwards, under, backwards. We're done.
Awesome.
Genius.
Sure, I followed every second of that, but I will give it a shot.
Well, okay. All right. Well,
Keith, give them a moment. Keith, give them a moment. May I make a suggestion? Unhighlight that and let them take a screenshot.
No. No, we'll call this figure 8.
Oh, you're going to send it to him. Very
okay.
cool.
All right,
Or
we'll come up
post
here.
it.
There it is there. We'll export it. A figure 8 preset. We'll put it in the show folder here. We'll save it.